Chapter 4092. However, the array was still in place. Meng Shuai's godhead could not escape the seal of the array, just like the three superior god kings. However, he could not stay in the array. He had to escape, even if it meant risking his life. Whoosh! Meng Shuai's walnut-sized diamond-shaped godhead blazed with five-colored flames as it slammed into the five-colored light wall in the north like a shooting star. As long as he could break through the light wall, he would have a chance to survive even if he was on his last breath. The other three god kings' godheads had been circling the edge of the array, full of fear. When they saw Meng Shuai leading the charge, they were overjoyed. They hurriedly followed Meng Shuai to the north. If they did not fight, they would die here anyway. Rather than that, they might as well take a gamble with Meng Shuai. If Meng Shuai could break through the five-colored light wall, they would be saved. If even Meng Shuai could not break through, they would have nothing to say but accept their fate. Boom! In the next moment, Meng Shuai's godhead, which was as fast as a shooting star, crashed into the five-colored light wall with a loud bang. The five-colored light barrier within a radius of thousands of kilometers shook violently from the impact, creating layers of ripples in the air. Divine light and countless fragments of light burst out from the point of impact. Meng Shuai's all-out attack was indeed powerful. A few cracks appeared on the five-colored light wall, and a series of cracking noises could be heard from it. Unfortunately, there were only cracks on the wall of light, and it didn't shatter. An incomparably powerful rebounding force sent Meng Shuai flying out backward. Two more cracks appeared on his godhead. His injuries worsened, and his consciousness blurred. When the three god kings behind him saw that the situation was bad, they could not stop even if they wanted to. At this critical moment, they could only force themselves to change direction and scatter to the sides, brushing against the five-colored light wall. They had failed this time. This also indicated that they would die without a doubt. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing arrived soon after. He slashed at Meng Shuai's godhead with his sword. Meng Shuai was at the end of his tether. He was barely conscious and could not fight. He didn't even have a chance to dodge as he was struck by those sword lights. Kaboom! There was an earth-shattering explosion. Meng Shuai's godhead shattered into a dozen pieces and scattered in the sky. A peak god king, the right-hand man of the Azura god emperor, and the second most powerful person on the boundless heaven continent, had fallen. When the other three god kings saw this scene, they were dumbfounded. Their minds went blank. For hundreds of years, Meng Shuai had been a lofty, powerful, and wise leader and overlord in their hearts. They regarded Meng Shuai as their idol, their pillar, and their pillar of support. They had never thought that there would be a day when Meng Shuai would die so tragically. They could not believe it, and they were unwilling to accept it. After all, Meng Shuai had been killed by Ji Tianxing. There was no way they could escape from this formation. They were doomed. Swoosh! Ji Tianxing waved his hand and grabbed Meng Shuai's godhead fragment, and he put it away. Then, he carried the divine hammer and the sword of burial of heaven and flew toward the godheads of the three god kings. The three god kings finally came to their senses. They were scared out of their wits and fled desperately. Unfortunately, their speed was nothing compared to Ji Tianxing's. Ji Tianxing teleported and caught up with one of the god king's godheads. He raised his sword and cut it into pieces. He waved his hand and collected the scattered godhead fragments. Then, he teleported 8,000 miles and appeared in another direction. He caught up with another god king. Crack! Another slash, and the god king's godhead was also cut into pieces. The third god king's godhead fragment did not escape the fate and was killed 3 breaths later. At this point, the battlefield finally quieted down. Ji Tianxing was the only one left. The 2,400 elite soldiers, including Meng Shuai, had all been killed by Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing's operation this time had come to a successful conclusion. He was not in a hurry to leave. He put away the divine hammer and the sword of burial of heaven and began to clean up the battlefield. The area within 10,000 miles had been reduced to ruins. There were pits and ravines everywhere. The wreckage of the 3 divine warships, the bones of more than 2,000 soldiers, and the broken armor and weapons were scattered in the ruins. Of course, there were also their space rings and godhead fragments. Ji Tianxing only wanted to clean up the battlefield and count the spoils. He first collected more than 50 God King godhead fragments. Then he collected more than 2,000 spatial rings. After doing all this in an hour, he waved his hand and struck the ground. Suddenly, the ruins within 10,000 miles surged with huge waves and completely reversed. All the wreckage, fragments, and traces were buried by the soil. The ground was also restored to its original level. Ji Tianxing then cast a spell to remove the formation and retrieve the 36 divine weapons that were scattered around. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. One by one, the divine weapons flew out from the bottom of the lake. They flew across the sky and returned to Ji Tianxing's hands. When the 36 divine weapons were all retrieved, the five-colored light shield within 10,000 miles dissipated. Voila! The emerald lake water that was blocked outside by the five-colored light shield suddenly surged and quickly filled up the empty space within 10,000 miles. Not long after, this place was submerged by the lake. When the lake returned to its calm state, all traces were covered as if nothing had happened. At this time, Ji Tianxing had already stepped on the road back to Yanchu's grotto heaven. He was still driving the deity, slaying worship, flying high in the sky at lightning speed. Of course, this time he was not in a hurry to save people, so he did not go all out. This could save a lot of cultivation resources. Even if the deity, slaying worship, was sailing at its normal speed, it was still 3 times faster than a peak divine king. In the cockpit of the warship, a few formations were operating normally. Ji Tianxing did not have time to check the spoils of war. He was worried about Nangong Ao's injuries. He took out the Zhouqianshu Tower and entered the distorted space-time. Swoosh! After a while, when he returned to the bottom of the Shuin sacred tree, he saw Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, Lan and the others gathered together to discuss something. He quickly walked over and saw everyone surrounding a cold jade bed. Nangong Ao, who was unconscious, was lying quietly on the bed. Previously, Nangong Ao's hair was disheveled and his body was covered in blood. He looked very miserable. At this moment, he was still covered in wounds. However, the blood and disheveled hair on his body had been cleaned up. Ji Tianxing could see that everyone was very attentive to Nangong Ao. They did not hesitate to use their divine power to clean up his blood. Tianxing, you're back. Brother Tianxing, did you defeat the Meng Shuai? At this moment, everyone saw Ji Tianxing return. They raised their heads and looked at him with concern. Although they did not show up, they did not help Ji Tianxing in the battle. However, they knew that Ji Tianxing's mission was dangerous and difficult. They were worried for him. Now that they saw him return safely without any injuries, everyone was completely relieved. Chapter 4093. Ji Tianxing used his divine sense to check on Nangong Ao's condition and asked everyone what had happened. After he handed Nangong Ao over to everyone, they ended their cultivation and did their best to treat Nangong Ao. Yin Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, and the others took turns to use divine techniques to help Nangong Ao control his injuries and replenish his divine power. Chao Qingyu was more attentive and even used his divine power to clean Nangong Ao's long hair and blood. Now, Nangong Ao's injuries were basically stable and his life was no longer in danger. However, his injuries were too severe and his spirit was too weak. He would probably sleep for another 10 days to half a month before he woke up. In addition, everyone also gave Nangong Ao a few divine pills to heal his injuries. After the effects of the divine pills were released, Nangong Ao's injuries would heal faster. After knowing this, Ji Tianxing was relieved and said to everyone, "Everyone, thank you for your hard work. Nangong Ao is usually very active. This is the first time I've seen him so quiet and embarrassed. As for Meng Shuai and his soldiers, don't worry, I've killed them all." Hearing this, everyone was shocked at first and then burst into cheers. Everyone was in disbelief. Really? Meng Shuai was a peak supreme god. You killed him so quickly? Didn't the intelligence say that Meng Shuai had more than 2,000 soldiers under his command? Most of them were supreme gods, and there were more than 50 supreme gods. Master's ambush strategy this time was too successful. It could be said to be perfect. Ha ha! Under the Shura God Emperor's command, there were two peak supreme gods guarding the boundless heaven continent. One was the Imperial Tutor, and the other was the Meng Shuai. I'm afraid no one would have thought that Meng Shuai would be killed before the real battle even began. Yes, this is what it means to be victorious from the get-go. He killed one of the enemy's leaders in the first clash. The Imperial Preceptor is definitely going to be mad. We have to spread the news as soon as possible and let those ancient clans and forces who are still watching see how powerful our master is. Everyone was talking excitedly. Even Bai Long came to join the fun. Everyone knew that this news was too exciting. Once it was spread, the entire boundless heaven continent would be shocked. The morale of the Shura God Emperor soldiers would be dealt a fatal blow. The morale of the rebel alliance under Ji Tianxing's command would be boosted and their confidence increased. However, Ji Tianxing waved his hand to stop everyone. Don't worry, the battle has just finished. The whole thing. After all, we have to go through with our act. At the very least, we have to wait until I return to Yinshu's cave before we release this news. Everyone thought Shen made sense. What the world knew was that the God of Swords had just left the cave of Yinshu not long ago and was on his way to the Jinwu region. If the news of Meng Shuai's death was released now, no one would believe it. At the very least, everyone knew that the Sword God had used his clone to deceive everyone, including the 8 forces of the Anti-Rebels Alliance. Even if Ji Tianxing explained, the 8 forces would not take it to heart. However, no one knew what kind of rumors would spread. In short, this kind of thing would become an unstable factor and be used to sow discord between the Rebel Alliance. All right, you guys put in some effort and take good care of Nangong AO. Bai Long, help me pilot the deity slayer worship. Ji Tianxing planned to check the spoils of war in the distorted space-time while he was on his way. However, the deity slayer worship needed someone to take care of it. Otherwise, it would be bad if it deviated or something happened. Bai Long gladly agreed and quickly followed Ji Tianxing out of the distorted space-time and appeared in the cockpit of the warship. In the high-end and exquisite cockpit, the layout was simple and elegant. There were a total of more than 60 divine formations. However, only 8 of them were used to control the warship. Ji Tianxing spent a quarter of an hour to teach Bai Long how to pilot it. Bai Long was very smart. He learned it after just one lesson. Then, he happily piloted the warship and rushed back to the Grotto Heaven according to the planned route. Ji Tianxing returned to the distorted space-time and began to check the spoils of war. One day later, Ji Tianxing finished checking the spoils of war. Meng Shuai's shards of divinity and 57 deity kings' shards were sorted out by him. He had also gone through the interspatial rings of the 58 powerhouses. After a rough estimation, there were more than 30 trillion worth of cultivation resources. However, Ji Tianxing only wanted deity king-level cultivation resources, materials, elixirs, and artifacts. The rest were thrown into the heaven-mending pearl for the 5 elements world to devour. After so many years, the divine power storm in the 5 elements world was still ongoing. There was still about 70% of the endless star crystal cores left. As for the space rings of more than 2,000 Sir Gods, Ji Tianxing only took a cursory look and did not check them one by one. Almost every interspatial ring had billions to tens of billions of cultivation resources stored in it. More than 2,000 space rings added up to more than 40 trillion worth of resources. It would be a pity to throw them away, but these resources were relatively low level. There were very few deity, king-level treasures. Ji Tianxing did not accept them. Instead, he threw the 2,000 space rings to Yun Yao, Ji Ku, Chao Qingyu, and the others. These are the spoils of war I picked up when I was cleaning up the battlefield. They're the space rings of those Sir Gods. Take your time to check them. Take whatever you want. Therefore, he threw this tedious task to everyone. Apart from cultivating, there was nothing else for them to do. Even something as boring as checking the space rings was new and interesting to them. Everyone gladly accepted the 2,000 space rings. After taking care of Nangong Ao, they began to search the rings. Although most of the space rings contained ordinary resources, their value was not too high. However, they would occasionally encounter some strange items and valuable treasures. This experience of digging for gold in the sand brought a lot of fun to everyone. While everyone was busy checking the space rings, Tianxing meditated under the sacred tree. While he was recovering his strength, he was quietly planning his future plans. Everything had to be planned before acting. He had to see further ahead than the imperial tutor and plan earlier. Only then could he seize the initiative. For example, his ambush on the Meng Shuai could achieve such a perfect result because he had planned ahead and considered everything thoroughly. Unknowingly, 2 days had passed. The deity-slaying battleship was still in the center of the boundless heaven continent. It was still 2 days away from Yinshu Grotto Heaven. Today was the 14th of April. It was also the day that the Meng Shuai announced that he would kill Nangong Ao in public in the Empire of True Martial Arts. The people of the Empire of True Martial Arts had been waiting for this day with anticipation. Everyone thought that there would be a sea of people outside the gates of the capital. However, when tens of thousands of people ran to the gates at dawn, they found that the gates were tightly shut. The so-called killing of Nangong Ao in public would not happen at all. The confused and doubtful people asked around and realized that the atmosphere in the Empire of True Martial Arts was a little strange. Some of the well-informed experts had already found out the inside story. It was said that something had happened to the Meng Shuai and that he could not return to the domain of true martial on time. Nangong Ao could not be escorted back either. Chapter 4094. There is no such thing as an impenetrable wall. Even though Tianxing hadn't leaked any information, even Nangong Buhua and the leaders of the 8 factions had been kept in the dark. However, the ambushers and generals of the realm of true martial quickly sensed that something was amiss. The imperial tutor personally oversaw the realm of true martial and commanded more than 3,000 divine lords and over 100 godly kings to set up an inescapable net. He'd set up dozens of large formations in an area of 100,000 miles, one after another. As long as the Meng Shuai brought more than 2,000 soldiers and escorted Nangong Ao back to the realm of true martial. More than 5,000 divine lords, over 100 godly kings, and 2 peak godly kings. It was easy to imagine that Qin Shin wouldn't be able to return alive. However, one day before the Meng Shuai was to return to the realm of true martial, the imperial tutor suddenly couldn't contact him. 1 day later, not only did he lose contact with the Meng Shuai, but he also didn't return to the realm of true martial on time. He couldn't contact any of the 3 divine warships and 2,000 soldiers under his command. At that time, the imperial tutor realized that something was amiss. In order not to leak any information, he secretly sent a group of experts to the south to search. The result was indisputable. The group of experts split into 3 groups and searched the 3 routes that the Meng Shuai took back to the realm of true martial, but to no avail. From then on, the imperial tutor realized that something had happened to the Meng Shuai and that the 2,000 soldiers were most likely dead. The 3,000 experts lying in ambush in the realm of true martial also had a bad feeling. Rumors began to spread in the army, and many people secretly discussed it. On the 14th of April, the imperial tutor was certain that the Meng Shuai had most likely been intercepted and killed on his way back. He no longer held out hope that the Meng Shuai could return safely. At the same time, the news spread throughout the realm of true martial, and tens of millions of people fought over it. As a result, the news of Meng Shuai being killed by a mysterious powerhouse spread like wildfire from the Jinwu domain to the entire Boundless Heaven continent. In the past 2 months, the top forces of the entire Boundless Heaven continent have been paying attention to the battle between the Kenshin Rebel Alliance, the Imperial Tutor, and the Meng Shuai. It wasn't just the 18 ancient clans and 36 top forces. Even over 100 domain lords, close to 1,000 God King experts, and billions of civilians were paying attention and discussing this matter. After all, this unprecedented battle was related to the ownership of the boundless heaven continent and also determined the fate and future of hundreds of billions of people. The hundreds of billions of people living in the abyss of suffering naturally leaned towards the Kenshin, hoping that the Kenshin could overthrow the dark reign of the Shura god emperor and end their suffering. However, these common people had no strength, influence, or status. They also had no right to speak. They could not support Kenshin with their actions, so they could only silently pray for Kenshin. Only the 100 domain lords, 36 top forces, and 18 ancient clans were qualified to participate in this unprecedented battle. Now, before the battle between the Rebel Alliance, the Imperial Tutor, and the Meng Shuai had officially begun, news of Meng Shuai's death had already spread. At first, everyone expressed disbelief when they heard this news. However, when everyone calmed down and thought about it carefully, who would dare to spread rumors and spread news of Meng Shuai's death at this critical juncture? That was a heinous crime that could kill even one's friends and family. Moreover, the news came from the Jinwu domain, so it was highly credible. As a result, the entire boundless heaven continent was in an uproar. Many top forces, domain lords, and god king experts, as well as billions of civilians, discussed and vied with each other to spread this news. In just 2 short days, this news had spread to every corner of the boundless heaven continent. Almost everyone's first reaction was disbelief, followed by shock and surprise. As long as one was not a fool, one could guess that in the entire boundless heaven continent, who had the courage, speed, and strength to kill the Meng Shuai, who was protected by more than 2,000 soldiers? It could only be Kenshin. In fact, no one else in the entire realm of the gods could do it. Only Kenshin could create such a miracle. Most people did not know the inside story, nor did they know that Kenshin had only left the Yinshu Grotto Heaven a few days ago. It was impossible for him to kill the Meng Shuai so quickly. 95% of the people only knew that the battle between Kenshin, the Imperial Tutor, and the Meng Shuai had already begun. Moreover, in the first round of battle, Kenshin had emerged victorious. He had killed the Meng Shuai and eliminated one of the 2 leaders of the boundless heaven continent as soon as he made his move. How shocking and morale-boosting was this? Billions of civilians saw the dawn of hope and were filled with confidence and anticipation for Kenshin. From their point of view, Kenshin had dealt a heavy blow to the Imperial Tutor and the Meng Shuai from the very beginning. Next, he would be able to easily sweep across the boundless heaven continent and destroy the Azura god emperor's forces. When the territorial lords, ancient clans, and top forces heard the news, they were shocked and in disbelief. Their emotions became even more complicated. They knew the inside story and that Kenshin had only left the Yinshu Grotto Heaven a few days ago. At this moment, Kenshin should have just arrived at the domain of True Martial. However, Kenshin did not even go to the domain of True Martial. He had already killed the Meng Shuai a few days ago. This was too bizarre and too horrifying. Could it be that Kenshin had mastered some kind of spatial leap that allowed him to cross half a domain at once? Otherwise, how could he have arrived at the domain of True Martial in such a short time, set up an ambush halfway, and successfully killed the Meng Shuai and more than 2,000 soldiers? Everyone knew that the battle was chaotic. Even if Kenshin had killed the Meng Shuai, some of the 2,000 soldiers would have escaped. In fact, the Meng Shuai and the 2,400 soldiers had disappeared. They might have all been killed. This indicated that the sword god must have utilized a sealing array formation to be able to capture Meng Shuai and the others in one fell swoop. If he had to set up a sealing formation, it would have taken a lot of time. In that case, it was very likely that Kenshin had mastered the technique to cross half a domain in a single step. This made no sense at all. When the top forces and immortal kings analyzed this, they could not help but gasp. Their hearts were filled with fear and shock, especially the 100 territorial lords and the forces under the Azura god emperor. They were deeply uneasy and could not suppress the fear in their hearts. Even the Meng Shuai had been easily killed by Kenshin. If Kenshin's rebel alliance attacked them, Who could survive? No one could. The forces that had been wavering on the fence felt the most conflicted. On one hand, they marveled at Kenshin's terrifying strength, and on the other, they regretted not making the decision to join the Kenshin Rebel Alliance sooner. Otherwise, they would be celebrating excitedly and waiting to share the fruits of their victory. Some of the clan leaders and sect masters gathered their elders and protectors to discuss whether they should join the Rebel Alliance as soon as possible. After all, this was their last chance. When the final battle between the Rebel Alliance and the Imperial Tutor began, it would be too late for them to join. Chapter 4095. To be able to become the top clans and forces in the Boundless Heaven continent, the leaders must have the corresponding shrewdness. There were many things and reasons that everyone was well aware of. If they did not seize the opportunity this time, they would not be able to join the Rebel Alliance. After all, the 9 forces led by Kenshin were enough to kill the Imperial Tutor and destroy the Shura God Emperor's forces. What was the use of these forces? If they were in Kenshin's shoes, they would not agree either. Therefore, the leaders and powerhouses of several forces had to make a decision within 2 days. Of course, there were still more than a dozen forces that continued to remain neutral and observe the situation. These people had different ideas. Although they also wanted to overthrow the Shura God Emperor's rule and restore the glory and power of the past. However, they would not participate in the war personally to avoid attracting disaster. They did not side with the Shura God Emperor because they did not want to be lackeys, grovel, and oppose the Kenshin. They did not side with the Kenshin and join the Rebel Alliance because they did not want to take the risk of starting a war with the Shura God Emperor. Even if they received news that the Kenshin had killed the Meng Shuai, they also knew that the Kenshin was very powerful. However, they knew that even if the Kenshin killed the Meng Shuai and the Imperial Tutor and took control of the Boundless Heaven continent, it would only be temporary. As long as the Shura God Emperor was not dead, he would definitely seek revenge on the Kenshin whenever he returned to the Boundless Heaven continent. When that time came, Kenshin would most likely be killed by the Shura God Emperor. The Boundless Heaven continent would still be in the hands of the Shura God Emperor. The outcome would not change. If the Kenshin was killed, the forces that joined the Rebel Alliance would not have a good ending. All in all, these forces that remained neutral and observed the situation wanted to protect themselves. No matter how the situation in the Boundless Heaven continent changed, they only wanted to protect the foundation that had been passed down for tens of thousands of years. Bai Long drove the deity, slaying worship, and sped high in the sky. In another day, the battleship would be able to return to Yenshu's cave. At this moment, a communication jade slip flew from the sky and entered the pilot's cabin. It floated beside the White Dragon, shining brightly. White Dragon knew at a glance that this was a message sent to his master by someone else. However, his master was cultivating in the distorted space-time of the Divine Pagoda. The Jade Slip could not enter the Divine Pagoda, so his master could not receive it. Of course, the White Dragon would not receive the Jade Slip without permission, nor would it check the information inside. However, he thought that there might be something important waiting for his master to deal with. He couldn't delay it. Therefore, he used his consciousness to send a message to Ji Tianxing, who was in the distorted space and time. Ji Tianxing was not in seclusion. He was just cultivating. When he heard the White Dragon's call, he woke up. Only 3 days had passed in the outside world, but he had already been cultivating in the distorted space-time for 5 months. Now that his strength and spirit had fully recovered, he had reached his peak state. Shua! With a flash of white light, Ji Tianxing appeared in the cockpit of the battleship. White Dragon hurriedly got up and bowed. Ji Tianxing nodded slightly, indicating that he should focus on driving the battleship. He picked up the Jade Slip and knew at a glance that it was from Nangong Buhua. His consciousness entered the Jade Slip, and Nangong Buhua's voice immediately sounded in his mind. Young Master Dragon, now the entire Boundless Heaven continent is spreading that you killed Meng Shuai and more than 2,000 soldiers under his command. None of them were left alive. The news spread, and the entire Boundless Heaven continent was talking about it. Everyone was shocked. The patriarchs and sect masters also knew about this. They couldn't believe it, and came to ask me. They all guessed the truth of the matter and joined forces to ask me to send you a message to verify the truth. Just now, after the meeting in the Divine Light Palace, I sent them back for the time being. However, they will definitely come again tonight to ask for the result. You see, Nangong Buhua knew the truth. After Ji Tianxing finished the battle, he sent him a message to explain the situation and the result of the battle. However, Nangong Buhua had kept it a secret and did not reveal it to anyone. Even though he was pestered by the patriarchs and sect masters, he did not announce the result on his own. Instead, he asked Ji Tianxing first. Ji Tianxing was quite satisfied with this. He picked up the communication jade slip and sent a message to Nangong Buhua. Since the entire Boundless Heaven continent has spread the news, there's no need to hide it. It's about time. You can tell them the truth. Tell them that I'm on the way back to Yinshu Grotto Heaven. Ask their disciples to speed up. After replying to this message, Ji Tianxing returned to the distorted space-time and continued to cultivate. On the other hand, Nangong Buhua was secretly relieved after receiving the message. After all, the reaction of the 7 patriarchs and Su Balian was a little too strong. They joined forces to give him a lot of pressure. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing relented. Otherwise, there might be some awkwardness or unpleasantness. After all, the 8 experts felt that they were cheated and did not trust him. A day passed quickly. On the evening of the second day, the god-slaying battleship arrived at Yinshu Grotto Heaven. After entering Yinshu Grotto Heaven, the battleship flew across the sky at lightning speed and went straight to the main peak of the Light Palace. When the battleship arrived at the square outside the Light Palace, Nangong Buhua, the 7 patriarchs, Su Balian, and the others had been waiting for a long time. Everyone had a smile on their faces. They were excited and warmly welcomed Ji Tianxing back. Ji Tianxing kept the battleship and landed on the square alone. He responded to everyone's greetings and salutes. After the greetings were over, Ji Tianxing did not go to rest. He walked into the Light Palace, surrounded by the crowd. The leaders of the 9 forces gathered in the Light Palace. Ji Tianxing took the opportunity to discuss matters. He first announced the results of the operation and then talked about the next step of the plan. Although I've successfully intercepted and killed Meng Shuai, destroyed more than 2,000 soldiers under his command, and rescued Nangong Ao, the traps and ambushes of the Zhenwu domain have been destroyed. However, this is only the beginning of the war. The enemy has lost their leader, Meng Shuai, the Imperial Tutor, Patrol Commander Qi Yan, and many other Divine King experts. Especially Qi Yan. He and Meng Shuai split up and captured the 8th Elder in the northwest. They then beheaded the 8th Elder in public. Not only do we have to save Nangong Ao, but we also have to avenge the 8th Elder. Moreover, Qi Yan is also at the top of the death list. He is one of the targets that must be eliminated. Therefore, I will depart today to kill Qi Yan. No one expected Ji Tianxing to announce the next step of the plan without discussing it with the others. However, if he could kill Meng Shuai, it would be easy for him to kill Qi Yan. However, they still had to express their opinions and show their concern. Alliance Master, you have just returned from a mission. You should rest for 2 days before killing Qi Yan. That's right. You are our leader. You shouldn't put yourself in danger so many times. Everyone is worried about your safety. Alliance Master, I am willing to lead the 4 elders of my clan to follow you into battle. I am also willing to follow you to kill Qi Yan. Chapter 4096. Everyone present was a sly old fox. Of course, they knew how to seize the opportunity to take the credit. Qi Yan was not strong. He was only in the 9th level of the Divine King realm. Many of the experts present were confident that they could kill him. However, Qi Yan was of noble status. He was the commander of the patrol. Killing him would be a great achievement. In Ji Tianxing's death list, Qi Yan was one of the top 5 important figures. The first was the Imperial Tutor, and the second was the Meng Shuai. If they followed Ji Tianxing to kill Qi Yan, they could help Ji Tianxing and protect his reputation. At the same time, they could get credit for killing Qi Yan. Most importantly, Ji Tianxing had easily killed Qi Yan. Perhaps they didn't even need to do anything to get the credit. Who would not want to take advantage of such an opportunity? Therefore, the patriarchs of the 7 clans and Su by Lien eagerly signed up to go with Ji Tianxing. Unfortunately, Ji Tianxing rejected all of them. I have Qi Yan's whereabouts. You don't have to follow me. I can handle it. Don't forget that the mission I gave you is more important. So many days have passed, and there are only a few days left before the deadline. When will your disciples arrive? Hearing Ji Tianxing's question, the clan leaders and clan leaders were stunned for a moment. Then, they explained with a smile. Don't worry, Alliance Master. Our disciples are rushing at full speed. They will definitely arrive at Yinchu's heavenly abode before the deadline. How could we disobey the Alliance leader's orders? Don't worry, Alliance Master. Our clan will also arrive on time. Our disciples are rushing at full speed. They will arrive in 3 days at the latest. The clan leaders and clan leaders all said that their disciples would arrive on time. Ji Tianxing did not urge them anymore. He said in a dignified tone, "It will take me at least 8 days to kill Qi Yan. The deadline will be up in 5 days, and all the members of the Rebel Alliance will be here. When the time comes, you will have to follow the original plan and fight separately. Eliminate the targets and forces on the death list. The performance and contribution of each force will determine the rewards after the war. I hope that everyone can fight for the common goal and not for selfish reasons. If you think you can hide it from me, then go ahead and try. Don't say that I didn't warn you." His tone was very cold, and the threat in it was self-evident. The faces of all the patriarchs and sect masters stiffened, and a trace of nervousness and shame flashed through their eyes. Although they maintained a smile on the surface and repeatedly said that they did not dare. But in reality, everyone was vigilant in their hearts and hurriedly put away those selfish thoughts. In front of Kenshin, they did not dare to play tricks, especially since Kenshin had already warned them in public. If they dared to do it again, they would really be cutting themselves off from the Rebel Alliance. At that time, the Kenshin would not welcome them and might even expel them from the Rebel Alliance. They had the mark of the Rebel Alliance and were mortal enemies with the Imperial Tutor. If they offended both sides, they would have nowhere to go and their fates would be miserable. Such a consequence caused every force to be alarmed. Soon, the meeting was over. All the patriarchs, sect masters, and god kings left the meeting hall. Ji Tianxing stayed in the hall and reminded Nangong Buhua and Nangong Ni Huang of many things. When they walked out of the hall, the patriarchs and sect masters were not in a hurry to leave. They went to a secluded area and pretended to take a stroll in the garden, but in reality, they were communicating and discussing what had just happened. Everyone thought that Kenshin did not trust us enough and even hid it from us. Everyone was a little angry and wanted to wait for Kenshin to come back so that we could have a heart-to-heart talk with him. But now, everyone can see that Kenshin did not hide this and even reminded everyone in public. Yes, at this point, I'm not afraid of everyone blaming me. Actually, how shrewd is Kenshin? How can he not see that everyone has their own selfish motives? In the past, he did not point it out, but this time, since everyone wanted to make things difficult for him, he might as well point it out. So, everyone should settle down and do what they want to do. In that case, Kenshin left everyone some face. Previously, we all had our own selfish motives, so he was unwilling to trust us. If after today, everyone is still like before, I'm afraid Kenshin will be very disappointed. So, everyone, take care of yourselves. Don't have any more unrealistic fantasies. We have already joined the Rebel Alliance. This is something that the entire Boundless Heaven continent knows. Only by doing things wholeheartedly can we obtain Kenshin's recognition, trust, and reward. Don't forget, when the Alliance was established, they talked about basic benefits. Just now, Kenshin also said that after we succeed in quelling the rebels, he will still reward us according to our contributions. That's right. No matter what everyone thinks, our War God clan will not be a burden anymore. From now on, we will earnestly carry out all of Kenshin's orders. Our Jiang clan has never complained about Kenshin and has always followed orders. The Lan clan is also following orders and is most loyal to Kenshin. Everyone, please don't count our Lan clan in. Previously, it was you guys who were making a ruckus and wanted to ask for an explanation from Kenshin. Our Phoenix clan did not participate. The 7 clan leaders and Su Balian were all shrewd people. They immediately analyzed the situation and knew what to do from now on. Thus, everyone became righteous and loyal to the Sword God, as if they were not going to wallow in the mire with the rest of the Sword Gods. Thus, the 8 factions all had the intention to compete with each other. They all wanted to compete in future missions to see who could make a great contribution and obtain Kenshin's favor. In the Great Light Hall, the door was tightly shut, and only Ji Tianxing, Nangong Buhua, and Nangong Nihuang were in the hall. Nangong Buhua frowned and said worriedly, "Young Master Long, before you came back, the 8 clan leaders and sect leader were still making a ruckus and wanted to ask for an explanation from you. After all, you lied to them before and made them feel that they were not trusted. Just now, you exposed their selfishness in front of everyone and even threatened them. I'm worried." Before he could finish, Ji Tianxing interrupted him and chuckled. "What are you worried about? Are you afraid that they will be disloyal, selfish, and not loyal to the Rebel Alliance?" Sigh. Nangong Buhua did not say anything and only sighed in agreement. Nangong Nihuang was also a little worried. They don't want to take the risk and lose their own forces, but they want to gain credit. It's really hard to explain. Young Master, our alliance has just been established, and the trust between us still needs to be built up bit by bit. Don't be too hasty. This father and daughter pair had nothing to say about Ji Tianxing, but they were also worried sick about the Rebel Alliance. Ji Tianxing waved his hand and comforted them. "Don't worry. Those 8 guys are not fools and naturally know what to do. They have already joined the Rebel Alliance and have no way out. The only way out is to follow my orders and do things honestly and do as much as possible. So, your worries are unnecessary. Moreover, I reminded them today because I don't want to punish them after the matter really happens." Chapter 4097. As the saying goes, the ugly thing should be said first. Since the Rebel Alliance had just been formed, Ji Tianxing had to bring up the problem before anything awkward or unpleasant happened. This way, they could avoid dealing with those factions after the matter really happened, which would make it very difficult for everyone. Most importantly, Ji Tianxing's forces, methods, and schemes were all here. Even the Imperial Tutor and the Meng Shuai had suffered greatly in his hands, let alone the other 8 forces. Therefore, no one dared to fall out with him and could only obediently follow his orders. After listening to Ji Tianxing's explanation, Nangong Buhua and his daughter heaved a sigh of relief. Since Ji Tianxing was confident that he could defeat those 8 forces, they had nothing to worry about. Then, Nangong Buhua continued to report, "Young Master Long, just before you came back, I received 4 messages." Ji Tianxing raised his eyebrows, and the corners of his mouth curled into a playful smile as he asked, "It's those forces that waver and watch in the dark, right?" Nangong Buhua quickly nodded and said, "Yes." Yesterday, the news of the Meng Shuai's assassination spread. Today, they eagerly sent a message to express their willingness to join the Rebel Alliance. Nangong Nihuang curled her lips in disdain and said, "These guys are too arrogant. They think they are very smart, but they are actually a bunch of clowns. Now that they saw you easily kill the Meng Shuai and more than 2,000 experts, they finally made up their minds." Since Nangong Buhua had already said what he wanted to say, he did not make any more comments and asked directly, "Young Master Long, how do you think we should deal with this matter? Do you agree or disagree?" Ji Tianxing smiled and said, "When the Rebel Alliance was just formed, I already said it. As long as those clans and top forces are willing to help us overthrow the Shurigod Emperor, I will not reject them. Of course, I have to agree. However, I am not in a hurry to give them an answer. In the next 2 days, there should be a few more forces that have made up their minds and sent messages to request to join us. When the time comes, we will deal with them together." Nangong Buhua immediately revealed a fox-like smile, as if he understood. He nodded and said, "Okay, let's do as you say. Let's leave them alone first." After hesitating for a moment, he asked again, Young Master Long, may I ask what kind of treatment do you plan to give those forces if they join the Rebel Alliance? Before Ji Tianqing could answer, Nangong Nihuang frowned and said, they joined later and obviously do not have the determination and sincerity. Ji Tianqing smiled and said, of course they don't have the qualifications to talk about conditions, but if you want them to work hard, you still have to promise them certain benefits. How about this? I'll grant them a region of land, limited to their respective regions, if they think the conditions are too. Nangong Buhua said with a playful smile, of course. If they want to haggle, then tell them to scram. Being able to get them to join the alliance and obtain a region of land was already good enough. At the very least, they would be able to preserve their foundation after the matter was settled. Those forces that go against us can't even protect their 10,000 years of foundation. Comparing the two, they will be satisfied. Ji Tianqing nodded and said, very good, I will leave this matter to you. Also, I have divided the death list into two and will give it to you now. You will lead those forces to deal with the experts and forces on the first list. I will command those 3 forces to deal with the second list. Nangong Buhua nodded and asked, Nangong Ao and the 8th Elder have not collected enough information, and the death list is only 80% complete. What about the remaining 20%? Do we still need to send people to investigate? No need. Ji Tianqing waved his hand and said, when we fight with the Imperial Tutor, many forces hiding in the dark will jump out. Even if there are some forces hiding very deeply, don't bother about them for now. After we take control of the Boundless Heaven continent, you can slowly investigate and eliminate them. You must know that even if we take control of the Boundless Heaven continent, you will still have many things to do. When Nangong Buhua heard this, not only did he not feel tired, but he also felt flattered and pleasantly surprised. Of course, he understood the meaning behind Ji Tianqing's words. He was clearly saying that after Ji Tianqing took control of the Boundless Heaven continent, he would go to other continents. And, as Ji Tianqing's spokesperson, he would take control of the Boundless Heaven continent. What kind of glory and power was this? It also showed how much Ji Tianqing trusted and valued him. How could Nangong Buhua not be excited? Nangong Nihuang was also very smart. She understood Ji Tianqing's deep meaning, and her beautiful eyes couldn't help but light up. She looked at Ji Tianqing with eyes full of gratitude. Ji Tianqing did not say anything else. He opened the spatial door of the Divine Pagoda and pulled Nangong Ao out of the distorted space-time. A few days had passed in the outside world, and he had been recuperating in the distorted space-time for half a year. Although his injuries were still serious, at least he was awake and could recuperate by himself. I will leave Nangong Ao to you. Let him stay in Yinshu Grotto Heaven to recuperate. After this battle, I will reward him according to his merits. Ji Tianqing handed Nangong Ao to Nangong Buhua and was about to leave the Great Hall of Light. He had told them everything that needed to be told, and now he was going to the northwest to kill the patrol commander, Qian. Nangong Buhua and Nangong Nihuang chased after him, wanting to send him out of Yinshu Grotto Heaven. But Ji Tianqing refused. There is no need to send me out. It is not a good thing to attract attention. Take care of Nangong Ao first, and remember to control the situation. After he finished speaking, he waved at Nangong Buhua and his daughter and flew up into the sky. Nangong Buhua and Nangong Nihuang stood outside the palace gate, looking up at his figure. Nangong Ao, who was very weak, also wanted to walk over and send Ji Tianqing off with his eyes. But his injuries were too serious, and he fell down before he could take 2 steps. Nangong Buhua hurriedly helped him up, asked about his injuries, and sent someone to send him back to his residence. Next, Nangong Buhua and Nangong Nihuang went to do their own tasks. Although they were worried about Ji Tianqing's safety, but they were not vague about what they should do. They also understood that only by controlling the situation and guarding Yinshu Grotto Heaven could they avoid Ji Tianqing's worries. Not long after, the leaders of the 8 forces also heard the news of Ji Tianqing's departure. Although they were mentally prepared, Ji Tianxing's eagerness to leave still surprised them. At the same time, they were also a little disappointed. After Ji Tianxing left Yinshu Grotto Heaven, he only told Nangong Buhua and his daughter some things, and did not even greet them. It was clear who was more important and who was more trusted by Ji Tianxing. But they were not jealous, and they knew that it was useless. They secretly made up their minds to make contributions and let Ji Tianxing see them in a new light. Chapter 4098. Whoosh! The Godslayer battleship streaked through the sky like an invisible black line, heading toward the northwest. Inside the battleship, White Dragon was piloting the ship. Ji Tianxing had already entered the distorted space-time of the Jiuqian 10 Absolutes Pagoda to cultivate. Sai, Master was born to be busy. He's been constantly on the move all his life, without a moment's rest. Seeing his master so busy, White Dragon sighed emotionally. But he also knew that from the moment his master began his revenge mission, he was destined to be on the move and kill. Only when the 5 God Emperors were killed would his work end, and he would be able to enjoy a long period of peace. He didn't feel tired, but he didn't want to see his master so tired. But he was too weak. Even though he had become a God King, he couldn't help his master much. Now that his master had given him the most important task of piloting the battleship, he could only do his best to fulfill his master's trust. Ji Tianxing was already a peak God King, but he discovered that his strength and cultivation base hadn't reached the limit. There was still room for improvement. As a peak God King, he was at least 10 times stronger than an ordinary peak God King. If he reached the limit, he would be many times stronger than a peak God King. Based on his past experience, he guessed that it would be 99 times. 99 times stronger than a peak God King? Is that still a God King? I'm probably a God Emperor now, right? With this thought, Ji Tianxing decided to continue cultivating and increasing his strength so that he could reach the limit as soon as possible. In the battle to kill the Meng Shuai, he had obtained more than 50 quintessence fragments, but he hadn't had the time to refine them. Now that he was on the move, he could refine them and absorb more divine Tao laws while increasing his strength. Before he set off, he had already obtained the relevant information. 10 days ago, Qi Yin had led 2,000 soldiers to the rising waters in the northwest, capturing and killing the 8th elder of the Nangong clan. After that incident, Qi Yin and the 2,000 soldiers under his command temporarily stayed in the Water of Breath to rest and reorganize. Moreover, the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai had given him instructions to carry out his mission there. However, Ji Tianxing's destination this time was not the rising water realm. He still had to continue heading north. This was because he had let Nangong Buhua personally take charge of the Nangong clan's intelligence network. At the same time, the rebel alliance's Shimi Grotto Heaven had one of the best intelligence networks in the Boundless Heaven continent. Through Shimi Paradise's investigation, he learned that Qi Yin had left the Water of Breath with his subordinates 2 days ago. 2 days ago, the news of Meng Shuai's assassination had just spread. Even though the Shimi Grotto Heaven's intelligence network couldn't find out why Qi Yin had left or where he had gone. However, after Ji Tianxing received the news, he could roughly guess Qi Yin's movements after careful analysis. Firstly, the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai had set up a trap in the Jinwu domain to ambush Ji Tianxing. However, Meng Shuai was killed and Nangong Ao was rescued. Their plan was ruined. The imperial tutor would not continue to stay in the Jinwu domain. He would definitely leave with his 3,000 soldiers. Therefore, Qi Yin would definitely not go to the Jinwu domain. Secondly, the Shura God Emperor's base was in the Dark Night domain in the north. That was the Shura God Emperor's base camp. Usually, the imperial tutor, the Meng Shuai, and Qi Yin would guard that place. Now that the Meng Shuai had been killed, the morale of the imperial tutor's troops was unstable. Out of consideration for stability, the imperial tutor would most likely lead his soldiers back to the Dark Night domain to make further plans. Therefore, Ji Tianxing speculated that Qi Yin and his 2,000 soldiers must be on their way to the Dark Night domain. From the Water of Breath to the Dark Night domain, they would have to cross 8 domains. If Qi Yin were to travel alone, he might be able to arrive in 8 days. However, He would be traveling with 2,000 soldiers on a divine warship, so he wouldn't be traveling too fast. Even if he flew at full speed, it would still take 10 to 11 days. In Ji Tianxing's mind, he had already deduced the route from the Water of Breath to the Dark Night domain. He knew exactly which domains were on this route and which important locations it would pass through. Now that 2 days had passed, he could roughly estimate Qi Yan's location. However, it would take at least a day for the White Dragon to reach that location on the divine warship. By then, Qi Yan would be far away. Therefore, Ji Tianxing had to calculate the divine warship's route and where he would be able to intercept Qi Yan through complicated and meticulous calculations. To many godly kings, it was very difficult for them to guarantee the accuracy of this question given their knowledge. However, Ji Tianxing only needed 10 breaths of time to calculate the correct result. 2 days later, in the windswept empire's territory, the divine warship's route would cross with Qi Yan's. He could intercept and kill Qi Yan there. Of course, the premise was that Qi Yan was rushing back to the Dark Night domain as fast as he could. 2 days in the outside world was equivalent to 100 days in the distorted space-time. Ji Tianxing had collected more than 50 quintessence fragments. Only 17 of them belonged to God Kings, while the rest belonged to intermediate God Kings. Refining these quintessence fragments should have been faster. However, the first to be refined was, of course, the Meng Shuai's quintessence fragment. After all, many of the imperial tutors and Meng Shuai's plans, actions, and secrets were hidden in the memories of the Meng Shuai's soul. Ji Tianxing spent a month carefully refining the Meng Shuai's memories. As expected, he had obtained countless secrets. Through the memories of the Meng Shuai's soul, he learned many of the Azura God Emperor's secrets. For example, in which year did God Emperor Xiao Luo lead his elite troops, and which high-level divine kings left the divine world for the extraterrestrial starry skies? He also knew how many cultivation resources the boundless heaven continent collected every year and transported them to outer space once every 50 years. He also knew the rough route of the people responsible for transporting the resources. Another example was that of the current 18 ancient clans and 36 top forces. 6 of them pretended to be neutral on the surface, but they were secretly the Azura God Emperor's lackeys. There were also 3 superpowers that had been living in seclusion for more than 2,000 years. In fact, they had long since submitted to the Azura God Emperor. There were also many bits and pieces of information and secrets that ran through the timeline of more than 800 years. They clearly showed the Meng Shuai's experiences over the years. After refining the Meng Shuai's quintessence fragment, Ji Tianxing gained a deeper and more thorough understanding of the boundless heaven continent. The number of experts the Azura God Emperor had left on the boundless heaven continent, the distribution of their forces, and the battle plans of the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai were all in Ji Tianxing's hands. To him, this was an immeasurably valuable gain. It was as valuable as a supreme-grade, king-level divine artifact. At the very least, it would allow his rebel alliance to avoid detours and reduce casualties in their future operations against the imperial tutor. They could even gain insight into opportunities. Among the many secrets the Meng Shuai knew, there was one that was particularly important. That was, the Azura God Emperor knew that Kenshin had returned to the God realm and wanted to destroy his forces on the boundless heaven continent. However, the Azura God Emperor did not intend to pay attention to it. That was because the research in outer space had finally reached a critical juncture. Chapter 4099. Ji Tianxing had thought that he'd be able to learn more about the gray mist from the Meng Shuai's memories. He hadn't expected that even the Meng Shuai wouldn't know much about the Azura God Emperor's plans. After all, the Meng Shuai and the imperial tutor had been ordered to guard the boundless heaven continent and hadn't left the God realm for nearly 1,000 years. Somewhat disappointed, Ji Tianxing thought to himself, "It seems that I'll have to go to the stars if I want to investigate the gray mist. The Azura God Emperor is extremely secretive about this matter. Even confidants like the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai haven't divulged any useful information or secrets. After refining the Meng Shui's quintessence fragment, Ji Tianxing moved on to the other God King's quintessence fragments. Before he knew it, 100 days had passed. In total, he'd refined 10 quintessence fragments and gained 100 new laws of the divine Tao. The Meng Shui was the main reason he'd gained so many laws of the divine Tao. After all, the Meng Shui was a bona fide peak God King who'd mastered nearly 900 laws of the divine Tao. After this round of cultivation, Ji Tianxing's mastery of the divine Tao had reached 1,300 laws of the divine Tao. He still didn't know how many laws of the divine Tao a God Emperor could master. However, he knew that within the God King realm, he was already unprecedented and would not be surpassed in the future. That evening, the white dragon steered the Godslayer worship toward the predetermined location. Ji Tianxing had no choice but to call it a day after cultivating for 100 days in the distorted space-time. He'd have to wait until he killed Qi Yin to refine the remaining 40 or so quintessence fragments. The setting sun was as red as blood. Outside Heaven's Bridge Pass, cold winds rustled. A dark green forest stretched in the distance, while withered yellow weeds swayed in the wind nearby. The Godslayer warship flew straight toward Heaven's Bridge Pass. According to Ji Tianxing's calculations, Qi Yin and his subordinates would pass by when he arrived at Heaven's Bridge Pass. After all, this was where Qi Yin had to pass on his way back to the Dark Night Domain. Heaven's Bridge Pass was a cliff between two mountain peaks that was more than 2,000 feet deep. Below the cliff was a 1,000-foot wide river with endless water. The cliffs on both sides were straight and precipitous. The mountain peaks were more than 2,000 feet in height. Looking down at this cliff from high up in the sky, it looked as if it had been hacked by the heavens with a giant axe. That was why it had the name Heaven Chiming Pass. Below the cliff was filled with water vapor and clouds. The bridge pass was Heaven's Bridge Pass was always shrouded in a hazy mist. After the god-slaying battleship arrived at the Heaven Harmony Pass, it stopped at a height of 40,000 feet and hid within the clouds. Ji Tianxing and White Dragon stood in the cockpit, looking around vigilantly. At the same time, to find traces to find cheeses. Searched after searching is to search as to find is to as after a while, Bai Long couldn't wait any longer. He asked, Master, according to your calculations, Qi Yin will definitely pass by here if he wants to return to the Dark Night Domain. Even if your calculations are off, it shouldn't be more than 15 minutes, right? With the king level's flying speed, 15 minutes would cover a distance of a few 100,000 miles. Ji Tianxing nodded and said, Don't be anxious. Wait patiently. Bai Long nodded and said, Master, since there's a 15 minutes difference, wouldn't we be waiting for nothing if Qi Yin has already passed by? Ji Tianxing waved his hand and explained, It's impossible for such a situation to occur. I calculated based on his fastest speed, so he will only be later and not earlier. Bai Long thought it made sense. His master calculated based on Qi Yan's fastest speed. That was the ideal situation. But in reality, Qi Yin might not be able to maintain his fastest speed with 2,000 soldiers. Therefore, as long as Qi Yin and his men passed by Heaven's Bridge Pass, they wouldn't miss it. Master and Bai Long stood in the cockpit and waited patiently. Time passed quietly. The setting sun slowly set in the sky, and the sky gradually darkened. 15 minutes passed quickly. There was still no movement south of Heaven's Bridge Pass. Bai Long was a little anxious. He secretly frowned and thought, even if there is a mistake in Master's estimation, 15 minutes have already passed. He was worried that they would miss, but he couldn't remind Ji Tianxing. Moreover, as his disciple, he should have more confidence in his master. Just like that, the god-slaying battleship concealed its tracks and aura. The master and disciple continued to wait. The master and disciple's expressions and reactions were different. Ji Tianxing's expression was calm, and his eyes were clear. He looked calm and composed, as if he had a card up his sleeve. Bai Long, on the other hand, frowned and looked around. He was clearly worried and anxious. However, seeing his master's confidence and calmness, he calmed down a lot. Soon, another 15 minutes had passed. The setting sun had already set. The sky was getting darker and darker. Night gradually fell. Several times, White Dragon couldn't help but ask Ji Tianxing if they should search the south. Maybe Qi Yin and his men were on their way here. They could find them if they searched south, but that would make him look too impatient. Therefore, he could only put away his worries and anxiety and wait with his master. Finally, night fell. Heaven and earth returned to darkness. An hour had passed since Ji Tianxing's prediction, but Qi Yin still hadn't appeared. With the speed of the god-slaying battleship, Qi Yin and his men had already flown 5 million miles in an hour. No matter how one looked at it, the facts proved that Ji Tianxing's prediction was wrong. Bai Long was a little regretful. After hesitating for a while, he said, "Master, maybe Qi Yin is too cunning. He didn't pass by here. Why don't we rush to the Dark Night domain to kill him?" Everyone knew that Qi Yin was going to return his lair. It would be a sure thing to kill him in the Dark Night domain. However, doing so would waste more time, and there would be more dangers and uncertainties. Ji Tianxing raised his hand to stop Bai Long. He said calmly, "Don't worry. Wait a little longer. He should be here soon." In fact, Bai Long was certain that Qi Yin wouldn't be here. Seeing his master so persistent, he couldn't say anything. He could only wait patiently. Who knew that a miracle would happen after 100 breaths? South of Heaven Pass, in the night sky, tens of thousands of miles away, 2 spots of light appeared. The 2 spots of light, one in front and one behind, streaked across the night sky like shooting stars. They flew toward Heaven Pass as fast as lightning. Bai Long's divine sense could only scan a radius of 10,000 miles. He could only see the light, but he couldn't see what was in the light. However, Ji Tianxing's divine sense had already seen it clearly. The 2 spots of light were 2 god-slaying battleships that were thousands of feet long. Although the god-slaying battleships didn't have anything special about them, and there were no emblems on their bodies. However, for 2 god-slaying battleships to pass by Heaven Pass at this time, there was no one else other than Qi Yin and his men. Chapter 4100. At first, White Dragon had been filled with disappointment and was about to give up. But he hadn't expected 2 warships to appear at this time. When he saw the 2 lights, his first reaction was that his master's prediction was correct. Qi Yin had indeed come. Even though he was an hour later than predicted, Qi Yin had still passed through Heaven's Chimney Pass. White Dragon finally understood why his master had been so calm until now. He'd been certain that Qi Yin would pass through here. A thought flashed through his mind. Could it be that after killing the Meng Shuai, Master refined the memories of the Meng Shuai's soul and learned of the Meng Shuai's battle plan? The Meng Shuai had already ordered Qi Yin to return to the Anya domain. That should be the case. Otherwise, Master wouldn't be so confident. Thinking of this, White Dragon asked, "Master, did you refine the memories of the Meng Shuai's soul and learn of their plan? Was that why you were so certain that Qi Yin would pass through here?" Ji Tianxing calmly gazed ahead and slowly raised his hands. As the 2 lights drew closer and closer, he quickly gathered his divine power and prepared to use his ultimate skill to intercept the 2 warships. His answer to White Dragon's question was simple. No. Since he hadn't foreseen this, there was only one answer. He had indeed predicted that Qi Yin would pass through Heaven's Chimney Pass. White Dragon understood this as well. It was a matter of probability. After news of the Meng Shuai's death spread, Qi Yin had only 2 choices. The first was to return to the Anya domain as quickly as possible and meet up with the Imperial Tutor. The second was to head elsewhere as quickly as possible to carry out new orders or missions. In short, Qi Yin couldn't stay in the waters of respiration and wait for Ji Tianxing to kill him. There was only a 50% chance that Qi Yin would pass through Heaven's Chimney Pass. However, Ji Tianxing had analyzed the situation in Qi Yan's and the Imperial Tutor styles of conduct. He was certain that Qi Yin would choose the safer option, which was to return to the Anya domain. While these thoughts flashed through White Dragon's mind, the 2 lights had already arrived. It seemed that in another 2 to 3 breaths of time, the 2 battleships would cross the Sky Chimera Pass and fly towards the north. At this moment, Ji Tianxing finally made his move. Divine Clock, go! With a low shout, he suddenly exerted his strength and summoned the primordial chaos bell. A fist-sized divine clock flew out of the battleship and appeared high up in the sky, instantly expanding billions of times. Buzz! Following a muffled explosion, the primordial bell of primordial chaos expanded to a radius of 10,000 miles. It descended from the sky and covered the surroundings of Heaven Chiming Pass. The primordial chaos bell also enveloped the god-slaying battleship and the two black battleships. Under the control of Ji Tianxing, the divine bell once again released a majestic divine power, forming a light wall in the depths of the ground, completely sealing off the space within a radius of 10,000 miles. As a result, the two battleships were unable to escape even if they had wings. The world was already pitch black, so the primordial chaos bell that spanned thousands of miles didn't seem to have any effect on them. The 2,000 experts in the two warships did not notice anything amiss. Only the few god generals piloting the battleships realized that the divine clock had descended from the sky and covered all the light. The few god generals panicked and hurriedly controlled the arrays of the battleships to stop the battleships. In this way, the tragedy of the battleships crashing into the divine clock was avoided. The two battleships stopped in the night sky. The few god generals sounded the alarm and immediately woke up the experts in the battleships. There were more than 1,000 soldiers in each battleship. They were all in their rooms, circulating their energy or resting with their eyes closed. Suddenly, they heard the urgent alarm. Everyone rushed out of their rooms and gathered in the battleships. These soldiers were all well-trained and reacted quickly. In just 10 breaths, all 2,000 of them had gathered. Swoosh! Not only that, the few god generals piloting the battleships also opened the defensive arrays of the battleships. More than 200 cannons popped out and looked around cautiously. Once enemies appeared, they would open fire without hesitation. In fact, Ji Tianxing's speculation was right. The 2,000 well-trained soldiers in the two battleships were Qi Yan's subordinates. At this moment, Qi Yan was sitting in the main hall of the first battleship. He looked dignified as he issued a series of orders. He also spread out his divine consciousness to check the situation outside. Originally, he was a 9th-level divine king realm expert. His divine consciousness could cover a radius of 90,000 miles. However, his divine consciousness was blocked by the primordial chaos bell when it reached 10,000 miles. He could not extend it no matter how hard he tried. Qi Yan immediately realized that the divine artifact that sealed them was of a very high grade and powerful divine artifact. Then, his divine sense probed into the ground and came into contact with the underground light wall. The light wall was very powerful. Not only could it block his divine consciousness, but also gave him great pressure. Qi Yan had a few Upper King grade divine artifacts. He was well aware of the power of Upper King grade divine artifacts. Therefore, he immediately determined that the divine clock that sealed them was most likely a superior king grade divine artifact. Based on Qi Yan's experience, even a peak divine king might not have a superior king grade divine artifact. Originally, when he knew that the Meng Shuai was intercepted by Qin Shin, he was deeply afraid and fearful. On the way back to the Anya region, he was constantly on tenterhooks, guarding against Qin Shin coming to kill him. The heavenly generals under his command kept persuading him that Qin Shin had returned to Yinchu's grotto heaven and would not come to kill him. No matter how much the people analyzed and spoke with certainty, he did not let down his guard and worry. Even though he did not want to lose his dignity in front of his subordinates and appear to be timid and weak. However, he knew that Qin Shin could not be judged by common sense. He was best at creating miracles and creating the unthinkable. Just like how Qin Shin intercepted and killed the Meng Shuai. That was also impossible in the eyes of ordinary people. However, Qin Shin still managed to do it. Just like now, the soldiers thought that Qin Shin would not come to kill him. However, who could be sure? Who could guarantee? At least, Qi Yan thought that there was a 50% chance that Qin Shin would come to kill him. Reality proved that Qi Yan was right. However, He was not happy at all. Instead, his mood became heavier and his expression turned uglier. Kenshin, it must be you. Qian looked sharply at the night sky outside the warship and roared silently in his heart. Only you have the guts and strength to ambush me at Tianxiang Pass. Only you can take out a superior king grade divine artifact so casually. It seemed to be to verify his guess. Not far away, Ji Tianxing put away the deity-slaying warship that had been in an invisible state and had concealed its aura. Swoosh! He appeared alone in the night sky and stood proudly. His expression was indifferent. With his hands behind his back, he quietly looked at the two divine warships. His cold and sharp gaze seemed to be able to see through the cover of the warship and was directed at Qi Yin and the crowd. Even though he did not speak, there was an invisible murderous aura and power that spread between heaven and earth. Chapter 41:01. When Ji Tianxing put away the god-slaying battleship and removed his disguise and invisibility, he appeared in the night sky. The 2,000 soldiers in the two divine warships all noticed him. Everyone's divine consciousness was focused on him. Everyone was sizing him up. When they saw his face clearly, their expressions changed drastically. They were filled with shock and fear. It's Kenshin. Oh my God, it's Kenshin. No wonder he dared to ambush us alone. He's Kenshin. This is impossible. Didn't he return to the Inshu cave? How would he be here? It's over. It's all over now. We're all dead. There was no doubt that although the 2,000 soldiers had not seen Kenshin with their own eyes, they knew what Kenshin looked like. After all, a month or two ago, the imperial preceptor and Meng Shuai had given the order to send the appearance of the sword god to all the soldiers under their command. To the soldiers under the imperial tutor and the Meng Shuai, Kenshin was their ultimate target. How could they not recognize him? Before this, except for Qi Yin, no one would have thought that Kenshin would ambush them here. However, when it really happened, everyone was terrified and felt a deep sense of despair. Even if they had an absolute advantage in numbers, 2,000 against one Kenshin. Even if they had 40 divine kings and 2,000 surgods. Facing Kenshin alone, they still felt a chill down their spines. They were in extreme despair. This was Kenshin's reputation. A powerhouse who was trusted and relied on by his teammates and feared by his opponents. Just think about it. The Meng Shuai was so powerful that he led 2,400 soldiers. Weren't they all killed by the sword god? Not a single one was left alive. Their 2,000 men were no match for the Meng Shuai. Was there any suspense in the outcome? Of course not. While the 2,000 soldiers were filled with fear and despair, their morale had also fallen to the bottom, and their morale was at an all-time low. If it weren't for Qi Yin and the other divine generals, these soldiers would have been defeated long ago. Fortunately, Qi Yin was calm and collected. When he saw that all the officers and soldiers had ashen faces, he shouted coldly, "What are you panicking for?" No matter how strong Kenshin was, he was only one person. He's just a peak divine king after all, and not the invincible god emperor. What's there to be afraid of? Qi Yan's deep, dignified voice reverberated throughout the warship. At the same time, it was transmitted to another warship. The 2,000 soldiers who were slightly panicked and frightened quieted down a lot, but the fear in their hearts did not decrease. After all, Qi Yan's words didn't have much effect and couldn't change the outcome. Qi Yan continued, "I know you're afraid of the sword god's reputation, but could fear solve the problem? Would he be spared from death just because he was afraid of him? He's already used a supreme-grade king-grade divine clock to seal off an area of 10,000 miles. We have no way out. Even if it's me, it's impossible to escape." Hearing his words, the 2,000 soldiers became even more panicked. Many of their expressions and eyes were filled with fear and despair. They had no morale left at all. If it weren't for military rules and discipline, they would have already scattered and fled for their lives. However, it didn't do so. First, they were restricted by military rules. Second, they knew they couldn't escape. Even their commander, Qi Yin, admitted that they couldn't escape. How could they survive? The only thing they could do now was to stick together and listen to their commander's orders. Only then would they have a slim chance of survival. Seeing the soldiers gradually calm down, Yin felt slightly comforted. He said earnestly, "I believe everyone understands that we're in a desperate situation. Since we can't escape or hide, fear won't solve the problem. Then we can only fight with our backs to the river and fight to the death. Yes, we're not as strong as Kenshin. 2,000 soldiers are just cannon fodder in front of him. However, we have to work together and treat this battle as the last fight of our lives. Even if we die in battle, we have to die with honor, brilliance, and value. Even if I die here with you, we have to drag the Kenshin down with us. If we can die together, then we'll be the greatest heroes and our names will go down in history." Yin's words ignited the flames of hope in the 2,000 soldiers. Everyone's dim eyes regained their luster. Everyone was convinced by what he said, and all of them were determined to fight to the death, ready to fight one last time. Even if they died in battle, they had to bite off a piece of the Kenshin's flesh. If they could die together with the Kenshin, it would be worth it even if they died. Their names would definitely spread throughout the world and bring honor to their ancestors. As a result, the soldiers who had been listless and demoralized a moment ago became energetic and high-spirited again. If one observed carefully, they would realize that it wasn't the high morale of being invincible and full of confidence. Instead, it was the determination and heroism of being willing to die for justice. Yin saw this and was very gratified. He quickly ordered, "All soldiers, listen to my orders. Other than the soldiers guarding the warships, everyone else will follow me and form the 6 directions battle formation. Surround the Kenshin and fight to the death with him. Soldiers operating the warships must go all out and look for any opportunity to bombard the Kenshin." After giving the order, he led 10 of his personal guards and flew out of the warships first. Then, more than 1,900 soldiers flew out of the warships one after another and formed a battle formation in the night sky. The 80 soldiers guarding the warships immediately controlled the 2 warships and adjusted their direction to attack Ji Tianxing from the left and right. However, Ji Tianxing wouldn't give them a chance and wouldn't waste too much time making them form a battle formation. He didn't greet them and didn't waste any time. He attacked directly. Rain of Swords. In order to end the battle as quickly as possible, he used a large-scale destructive skill right from the start. He used all of his power and pointed his swords at the sky. His entire body released an invisible aura. At this moment, it was as if the heavens and earth were under his control. Even the thousands of stars in the outer space were under his control. Suddenly, countless stars appeared in the sky and poured down like a meteor shower. However, the night sky was blocked by the primordial chaos bell, so no one could see it. Yin and his soldiers only saw Ji Tianxing raise his hand to cast a spell, but they didn't know what was going on. Of course, they didn't care about this detail. They were busy forming a battle formation. After 2 breaths, as many as 90,000 starry swords fell from the sky and approached Heaven's Pass. At this moment, Ji Tianxing immediately put away the primordial chaos bell to prevent it from blocking the 10,000 starry swords. The divine bell that had been suppressing everyone disappeared. Tens of thousands of miles of heaven and earth were illuminated by the starry swords. The 2,000 soldiers couldn't get used to the sudden brightness. They couldn't open their eyes because of the brightness. Everyone was stunned for a moment and subconsciously looked up at the sky. When they saw the densely packed starry swords, everyone widened their eyes in horror and roared in horror. Chapter 4102. It was a pity. The 2,000 soldiers had yet to get into formation. When they saw the starry swords clearly, the rain of swords was only 100 miles away from them. Even though Ji Tianxing had removed the primordial chaos bell and released the seal on the 2,000 soldiers, it was too late for them to escape. At this critical moment, only Yin, 40 god kings, and some god lords instinctively released their divine power and formed a defensive shield. Then, 90,000 starry swords covered an area of 10,000 miles and drowned Heaven Chang Pass and the 2,000 soldiers. Bang, bang, bang. Boom, 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 boom. Sword lights splashed everywhere and a deafening explosion resounded through the sky. The lofty and dangerous Heavenchang Pass was instantly reduced to ruins by the 10,000 starry swords. Whether it was the mountain, the deep valleys, or the flowing rivers, they were all flattened by the starry swords. Dust was flying everywhere, and billions of starry swords were flying everywhere. Countless soldiers were screaming and wailing as they were on the verge of death. At this moment, everyone finally realized how powerful Kenshin was. Every starry sword that was 10,000 feet long had the power to destroy heaven and earth. It was enough to kill a lower god king instantly. 9 starry swords came down like dense raindrops, and their power was indescribably terrifying. Under the attack of the starry swords, the defensive shield that the soldiers had formed with all their might was as fragile as paper. The muffled and explosive sounds were the sound of the shields being broken. Most of the starry swords that flew everywhere were the fragments of the shields after they were broken. In just one breath, over 1,000 godlords were killed by the starry swords. They died without a complete corpse. More than 10 unlucky god kings were also killed by the starry swords. Not even their bones were left. Hundreds of godlords were lucky enough to survive, but they were severely injured and unable to fight anymore. Only Qi Yin and a few upper god kings were protected by King Grade High Grade Divine artifacts and barely managed to block the attack of the 10,000 starry swords. They were not injured. The rest of the people were either lightly or heavily injured. Even the 2 warships that were glittering and ready to fire at Ji Tianxing were blown into smithereens by the giant's swords and scattered in the ruins. The morale that the soldiers had accumulated with great difficulty was immediately extinguished by the rain of swords. The surviving soldiers looked at the wreckage around them and the tragic scene of flesh and blood flying in the air. They were all horrified and frightened. They no longer had the slightest bit of fighting spirit, and their minds were in a mess as they fled in all directions with all their might. However, the effect and power of the rain of swords was far more than just a single attack. After falling to the ground, tens of thousands of starry swords were shattered. However, there were still 80,000 starry swords flying back and forth in the sky, forming a huge sword net. Swish! Swish! The sword light shuttled back and forth, and everything within a radius of 10,000 miles was a world of starlight. This terrifying sword net was like a ball of starlight with a radius of 10,000 miles. It illuminated the surrounding 10,000 miles, and it was as bright as the moon. However, its lethality and the terrifying consequences it caused were completely different from that of the moon. The hundreds of injured monarch god experts were instantly sliced into pieces, turning into a rain of blood that filled the sky. Even many mid-level divine kings couldn't withstand the attack of the giant swords. They couldn't last more than 3 breaths before they were cut into pieces. After a long time, the power of the 80,000 starry swords was used up and gradually dissipated. The world returned to peace, and the ruins returned to darkness. Only the rain of blood was still falling, and the ruins were dyed red. The world was silent. The 20 or so survivors were dumbfounded. Qi Yin was also stunned. 2,000 divine monarchs and a dozen low-level and mid-level divine kings were all dead. Only Qi Yin, 8 high-level divine kings, and 14 mid-level divine kings survived by luck. Moreover, only Qi Yin was lightly injured. The others were all heavily injured, and they looked very pathetic and miserable. In the rain of blood, Ji Tianxing was still standing in the night sky with his hands behind his back. He didn't take out any weapons. He quietly looked at Qi Yin and the others. He didn't say anything and just slowly walked over. Instantly, Qi Yin and the others trembled in fear and instinctively stepped back. Ha ha! A few mid-level divine kings who were severely injured were so scared that their teeth chattered. Before this, Qi Yin and the other divine kings couldn't understand. Did Kenshin really kill the Meng Shuai and his 2,400 soldiers by himself? It was too unbelievable. Kenshin must have a large number of divine kings helping him. Otherwise, he couldn't have done it. Now, they finally knew the answer. That's right, Qin Shin killed the Meng Shuai and his subordinates by himself. As for how Qin Shin did it, they had already seen it with their own eyes. Qin Shin, you win. Seeing Ji Tianxing approach step by step, Qian's heart was dead. He was full of despair, and he sighed with a dejected expression. More than 20 elders also endured their injuries and stared vigilantly at Ji Tianxing. They slowly stepped back. Ji Tianxing continued to approach. He looked straight at Qi Yin and asked, "Qi Yin, do you know why I am here to kill you?" "Huh." Qi Yin sneered and said, "As everyone knows, you sent Nangong Ao and Nangong Qing to lead the Nangong clan's intelligence network to investigate our generals. You're making a death list. As the Inspector Commander, I am one of the top experts in the Boundless Heaven continent. Of course, I am on your death list. From the moment you killed Jin Shuang, I knew that you would come to kill me sooner or later." Ji Tianxing frowned and said coldly, "That's only part of the reason. I can wait and kill you when the time comes. But I didn't. I calculated the path you would take to return to the Dark Knight domain and killed you here. Think carefully, what other reason could there be?" Qian also frowned and asked doubtfully, "Isn't this reason enough? Other than this reason, I have no enmity with you. I didn't attack you back then." Seeing that he couldn't think of a second reason, Ji Tianxing's eyes became even colder. He answered directly, "The second reason is that I want to kill you to avenge the 8th elder, Nangong Qing." Qi Yin was even more confused. He said with a startled face, "You want to avenge Nangong Qing? But as far as I know, you have no relationship with Nangong Qing." "Ha ha! You are such a cold-blooded and heartless person, Qin Shin. How can you avenge a stranger? You saved Nangong Ao first, and then avenged Nangong Qing. In fact, it was just an act for the Nangong clan and other forces to see, right? You have to let everyone think that you, Qin Shin, sympathize with your subordinates and are very loyal. Only then can you buy people's hearts. Ha ha! I didn't expect that the high and mighty Qin Shin would play such a childish trick." Knowing that he was going to die, Qian was no longer afraid and mocked Ji Tianxing with disdain. Book Guest House Reading Website. Chapter 4103. The 20 God Kings nodded in agreement with Qi Yan's analysis. Everyone felt that it was reasonable. They were very disdainful and contemptuous of Ji Tianxing, and they all started to mock him. They probably knew that they were going to die, so they felt a sense of relief. They were not afraid at all, so they were very indulgent. Being able to laugh at the sword god once before he died was probably a form of consolation. Ji Tianxing could understand their feelings. He knew that this was their last release before they died, so he was not angry. He looked at Qi Yin and the others indifferently and said calmly, "You sinister, despicable, and inhumane people are used to seeing other people's lives as nothing. Therefore, your way of thinking and thinking only cares about benefits. It's normal for you to think this way, and I don't bother to explain. After all, your lives have come to an end. I won't see you again." After saying the last 3 words, he took out the sword of burial of heaven and prepared to send Qi Yin and the others on their way. Qi Yin also gripped his 2 swords tightly and stared at Ji Tianxing with murderous intent. He roared, "Soldiers, although we are not Qin Shin's match, we would rather die standing than live kneeling. Even if we bleed to the last drop of our blood, we will never surrender. Charge with me, kill." After roaring, Qi Yin waved his 2 swords, and his entire body exploded with killing intent. The 20 God Kings were affected by his solemn and stirring aura. Even though they were heavily injured, they threw aside their lives and waved their divine weapons recklessly, shouting as they charged toward Ji Tianxing. However, an extremely ironic scene occurred. More than 20 God Kings charged at Ji Tianxing without any regard for their own safety. They solemnly and resolutely charged at Ji Tianxing. Qi Yin, who was shouting the battle cry, stayed where he was and did not move. When everyone charged toward Ji Tianxing and both sides were about to clash, he quickly retreated and teleported away. That's right. He urged the injured God Kings to charge toward Ji Tianxing, hoping that they could hold Ji Tianxing back. As for himself, he had already made up his mind to take the opportunity to escape. Previously, The primordial chaos bell had sealed off a radius of 5,000 miles. He could not escape even if he wanted to. However, it was different now. Ji Tianxing had already put away the divine clock. There were no seals or restrictions around them. If he didn't escape now, when would he? You are indeed sinister and shameless. Ji Tianxing's divine sense had been locked on a Qi Yin the entire time. In fact, he had already guessed that Qi Yin was going to take the opportunity to flee when he heard Qi Yan's solemn, stirring, and heroic roar. The corners of his mouth curled into a contemptuous sneer. He threw out the sword of Burial of Heaven with his right hand and thrust it at Qi Yin. Burial of Heaven had also locked onto Qi Yan's divine soul aura. Like a meteor streaking across the night sky, it chased after Qi Yin. No matter how far Qi Yin ran, he would never be able to shake it off. At the same time, Ji Tianxing took out his divine hammer and swung it at the 20 over divine kings. Kill! I would rather die in battle than surrender. The divine kings roared as they waved their divine weapons and unleashed all kinds of divine abilities. Divine techniques covered the sky and poured down like a torrential flood. They were about to drown Ji Tianxing's figure. However, Ji Tianxing swung his divine hammer and smashed everyone's divine abilities to pieces. Immediately after, he swung his palm and sent out a few sword lights into the crowd. Bam! 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 One divine king after another was cleaved in half by the sword lights. Ji Tianxing was like a torrent of steel. He was unstoppable as he rampaged through the crowd. Wherever he swept past, the god kings would be smashed to pieces and their flesh and blood would splatter everywhere. Whether it was the divine hammer's attack, the fists, or the sword lights, they all had the power to destroy heaven and earth. Those divine kings were completely unable to block them. In just 3 short breaths, 80% of the 20 over divine kings were killed. Their divine bodies were smashed into smithereens. Their divine cores also exploded into countless fragments and scattered in the ruins. The few remaining divine kings were scared out of their wits. They hurriedly retreated. One of them was so bloodshot that he actually wanted to self-detonate. He roared hysterically, "Kenshin, let's die together." Wait. However, he was pulled back by his comrade, just as he was about to self-detonate. It was a white-haired, high-level divine king. He was covered in blood and looked miserable. He pointed to the empty night sky behind him and roared furiously. The commander ran away. That bastard Qi Yin told us to charge, but he took the opportunity to escape. The other divine kings finally reacted. They hurriedly looked at the night sky behind them and searched for Qi Yan's figure. Naturally, they couldn't find anything. At this time, Qi Yin had already escaped tens of thousands of kilometers away. Everyone had been deceived by Qi Yin and treated as cannon fodder. They were all filled with grief and despair. Thus, the white-haired divine king took the lead to surrender to Ji Tianxing. He shouted with grief and indignation, "Kenshin, Qi Yin is a treacherous, shameless villain. We are ashamed to be associated with him. Tonight, we have seen Kenshin for the first time. We deeply admire Kenshin's loyalty and loyalty. Thus, we admit defeat. We only ask that Kenshin spare our lives and give us a chance to turn over a new leaf. Even if we have to be your slaves, we are willing to be your lackeys." The old man's words were righteous, impassioned, and sincere as if they came from the bottom of his heart. The other divine kings were all stunned. They stared at the white-haired divine king, thinking to themselves, when did old Du become so quick-witted? What a beautiful statement. Thus, the divine kings came back to their senses and repeated the white-haired divine king's words. They looked as if they were sincerely remorseful. Ji Tianxing couldn't be bothered to look at them. He said expressionlessly, "Surrendering is useless. I don't need captives." With that, he waved his hand and sent out sword light and fist shadows. He swung his divine hammer at everyone. Kenshin, you bastard. Kenshin, you are so vicious." The divine kings were filled with fear. They roared angrily and ran for their lives. But it was all for naught. After a series of muffled bangs, the divine kings were all killed. Shards of their godheads were scattered all over the place. Ji Tianxing didn't waste time picking up the spoils. His figure flickered and disappeared. The next moment, he teleported thousands of miles away. He tore through the night sky as fast as lightning and chased after Qi Yan. At this moment, the Sword of Burial of Heaven was chasing after Qi Yan. It had already flown 200,000 miles. Qi Yan saw that Ji Tianxing wasn't chasing after him. Only a divine sword was chasing after him. He was both shocked and furious. Damn it, even Kenshin's sword is so heaven-defying? It can even take the initiative to chase after me? He wasn't convinced. He wanted to stop and fight to destroy the Sword of Burial of Heaven. But he had also heard of the legend of the Sword of Burial of Heaven. He knew that it was a divine sword with spirituality and consciousness. Most importantly, Kenshin could catch up to him at any time. Thus, he dismissed this thought and continued to teleport and flee. But unfortunately, no matter how fast he was, he couldn't be compared to Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing looked very relaxed. It was as if he was taking a stroll in the night sky. But with every step he took, he could teleport thousands of miles away. He took 40 consecutive steps and teleported 400,000 miles. His expression didn't change. Finally, when he was 450,000 miles away, he caught up with Qi Yan. Book Guesthouse Reading Website. Chapter 4104. The Sword of Burial of Heaven was Ji Tianxing's natal divine weapon, so they were connected. As long as the Sword of Burial of Heaven followed Qi Yan, Ji Tianxing would be able to find him no matter how far he ran. After Ji Tianxing caught up to Qi Yan, he immediately swung his sword and sent out a few sword lights. He also raised his divine hammer and smashed it at Qi Yan. Qi Yan was already injured, and he was exhausted from running. His divine power was weak. Seeing the dazzling sword lights and the mountain-sized hammer coming at him, he was terrified. He could only stop running and block with all his might. He knew how powerful the sword lights and hammer shadows were, so he didn't dare to hold back. He had to use all his divine weapons and defensive items to unleash all his potential. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. He held his sword with both hands and swung it. The sword lights formed a wall. Another 4 divine artifacts circled around him, circling and dancing, forming a thick divine light shield. He was burning with 5 colored flames. He used all his divine power, and his robe fluttered. In the next moment, several sword lights that could split heaven and earth struck Qi Yan hard. Kaboom! With an earth-shattering sound, the light shield formed by Qi Yan's 2 swords was shattered. Immediately afterward, there was a series of muffled bang-bang-bang sounds. The defensive light shield formed by the divine weapons around Qi Yan was also shattered by the sword lights. At this point, Qi Yan's double defense had been destroyed, and Ji Tianxing's sword lights had also collapsed. But the mountain-sized hammer shadow came at him. Qi Yan couldn't block it anymore. He could only burn his divine power and divine blood, turning them into bloody flames and using the last of his strength to protect himself. This was a forbidden divine power. Once it was used, it would consume thousands of years of divine power. It couldn't be recovered, and it would cause permanent damage to the body. Qi Yan wouldn't use this move unless he had no other choice. At this moment, he had turned into a giant bloody fireball. The surging blood-red flames enveloped him so tightly that his figure could barely be seen. Unfortunately, even this couldn't save his life. Boom! The mountain-sized shadow of the divine hammer smashed down and engulfed his figure. The blood-red fireball was smashed into smithereens on the spot, and countless blood-red fragments burst out. Qi Yan's body was also destroyed, turning into fragments that flew everywhere. Even though his divine body had been destroyed, his godhead had survived by a fluke. He had only suffered heavy injuries and was currently fleeing for his life. Even if he knew that he would not be able to escape from Ji Tianxing's pursuit and that he would die without a doubt. However, it was impossible for him to sit and wait for death, and he would never give up the slightest hope of survival. Shwa! With a flash of white light, Ji Tianxing teleported in the night sky. He crossed 20,000 miles in 2 steps and caught up with Qi Yan's godhead. Once again, he swung his sword and slashed out 4 sword rays. which shrouded Qi Yan's godhead and prevented him from escaping. This time, Qi Yan would not be able to escape. Boom! Amidst a muffled sound, Qi Yan's godhead was shattered by the sword light, turning into a dozen pieces that drifted down into the night sky. A ninth-stage realm divine king expert, Boundless Heaven Continent's patrol commander, had fallen just like that. When the divine light scattered, heaven and earth returned to darkness. Ji Tianxing also picked up Qi Yan's godhead fragments and flew away. Very soon, he returned to the previous battlefield and began to clean up the battlefield and collect the spoils of war. The battlefield with a radius of 10,000 miles had long turned into a mess of ruins. There were pits and cracks everywhere, and the air was still filled with the smell of blood. 2,000 soldiers' broken corpses, weapons, and armor fragments, as well as the wreckage of the 2 warships, were scattered in the ruins. Ji Tianxing's divine sense covered a radius of 10,000 miles and accurately collected close to 2,000 interspatial rings, as well as 40 pieces of the divine king expert's godhead fragments. As for everyone's armors and weapons, most of them had been shattered by the sword rain, so there was no need for them. After collecting the spoils of war, Ji Tianxing struck out a powerful force of earth with his palm, reversing the ground within a radius of 10,000 miles. Rumble, after a series of muffled noises, the ground returned to its original level. The traces of the battle, fragments, and wreckage were all buried in the depths of the ground. Ji Tianxing then took out the god-slaying warship and let Bai Long drive the warship away. After returning to the warship, Ji Tianxing did not meditate. After all, he was not injured in the battle, nor did he consume too much divine power. He was still in good condition. Bai Long activated the formation of the warship, but did not know where to go. He asked, "Master, where are we going next? Back to Yanchu's paradise?" Ji Tianxing waved his hand and said, "We don't have to go back to Yanchu's paradise. Fly south first, and I'll ask Nangong Buhua." Bai Long acknowledged his master's order and drove the warship to the south. He knew that his master did not want to return to Yanchu's paradise. It was a waste of time. His master wanted to ask Nangong Buhua if all the disciples of the 8 forces had arrived. After all, half a month's time was almost up. If all the 8 forces had arrived, his master would definitely proceed with the next step. As expected, Ji Tianxing took out the communication jade slip and asked Nangong Buhua about the situation. He also explained that he had killed Qi Yan. After Nangong Buhua received the message, he was naturally surprised and shocked. He was surprised by Ji Tianxing's strategy and efficiency. Then, he replied to Ji Tianxing, saying that all the disciples of the 8 forces had arrived today. Just as Ji Tianxing had stipulated, each force had sent 1,000 people. Among them, there were 20 divine kings and 200 upper divine lords. The other 700-plus disciples were all middle and lower divine lords. There was no other way. Only those who were above the divine lord realm were qualified to participate in the war at the pinnacle of the boundless heaven continent. Those divine spirits in the heavenly god realm were not even qualified to be cannon fodder. After all, a war of this level was already worthy of being called a war of the gods. A few forces followed Ji Tianxing's rules. However, there were 2 forces that surprised Ji Tianxing. One was the War Gods clan. They had sent 1,200 people. Among them were 30 divine kings and 300 upper divine lords. The other was the Phoenix clan of the divine Phoenix Grotto Heaven. They had sent 1,300 disciples. Among them were 32 divine kings and 350 upper divine lords. This undoubtedly showed that these 2 ancient clans trusted and supported Ji Tianxing more. It was also obvious that they were not afraid of sacrificing themselves. They wanted to make a name for themselves in this war. This was because when the alliance was formed, Ji Tianxing had said that when they achieved hegemony in the future, they would be rewarded according to their contributions. No one knew how Ji Tianxing would reward them. However, they all believed that Ji Tianxing would not be stingy. There would definitely be substantial benefits. It would definitely not be just verbal praise or some insignificant glory. Even if Ji Tianxing did not reward them with substantial benefits, they would still gain Ji Tianxing's trust, regard, and friendship. There was no need to mention the benefits of becoming friends with Kenshin. Chapter 4105. The disciples of the Nangong clan had already gathered and were on standby. Since the disciples of the 8 powerhouses were all present, there was nothing more to be said. Ji Tianxing's next step of the plan could begin. Hence, after Ji Tianxing received Nangong Buhua's report, he immediately sent out a message and gave out an order. Order Deputy Alliance Leader Nangong Buhua to lead the Lan clan, War God clan, Xia clan, Shimi Cave, and Jiang clan to battle immediately. With Yinshu Cave as the boundary, sweep across the regions to the south and eliminate the targets on the death list. Also, make the lords of the regions submit and swear to surrender. Those who do not surrender will be killed without mercy. The first message was sent to Nangong Buhua and also to the 5 ancient clans. The content was clear, and the mission was simple too. At the end of the message, there was an oath of surrender. It was still 1,000 words long and was an improved version of the Heaven Dao Oath. Ji Tianxing asked Nangong Buhua to lead the 5 ancient clans to the south of Yinshu Cave to eliminate the experts and powerhouses on the death list and force the lords of the regions to surrender. When the alliance was first formed, Nangong Buhua had asked Ji Tianxing if he wanted to kill the lords of the regions. Ji Tianxing had said that if the lords of the regions were sensible, he could spare their lives. After all, his goal was to conquer the entire boundless heaven continent and subdue all the lords of the regions, not to kill all of them. After giving the order to Nangong Buhua, Ji Tianxing took out a communication jade slip and sent a message to the leaders of the Feng clan, 100 Smelting Ancient Sect, and Yuchi clan. Set off immediately and sweep across the regions to the north of Yinshu Cave. Eliminate the targets on the death list and make the lords of the regions submit and swear to surrender. Those who do not surrender will be killed without mercy. The message was sent to the 2 ancient clans and 100 Smelting Ancient Sect. After the 2 clan leaders and Su Balian received the order, they did not dare to slack off. From everyone's point of view, the regions to the south of Yinshu Cave did not have any important figures or peak divine kings guarding them. Asking Nangong Buhua to lead the 5 forces to sweep the area seemed like a waste of talent. The area to the north of Yinshu's Grotto Heaven was even wider. There were many strong cultivators, and the Imperial Tutor was in charge of the Dark Knight region. That was the lair of the Azura God Emperor. In the end, only the Phoenix clan, the 100 Refinements Ancient Sect, and the Yuchi clan went. No matter how he looked at it, it seemed like he was overestimating himself and was courting death. However, after Ji Tianxing's order was relayed back to Yinshu's cave, all the forces accepted the order gladly and began to act immediately. No one felt that it was inappropriate, and no one objected to Ji Tianxing's decision. Firstly, the mission given by the Nangong clan and the other 5 forces was very easy, so they naturally wouldn't resist. As for the Phoenix clan, 100 Refinements Ancient Sect, and Yuchi clan, they felt that this task was extremely difficult and heavy, but they did not object, because the person who led them on this mission was Ji Tianxing. In the eyes of Nangong Buhua and the 8 forces, Ji Tianxing was a peerless expert who could fight against millions of division masters. As long as he was around, the Imperial Tutor, strong cultivators were nothing to fear. When the Phoenix clan, Yuchi clan, and 100 Refinements Ancient Sect left Yinshu's Grotto Heaven, they unanimously decided to make Qingfeng region their first target after a short discussion. Qingfeng region was located in the north of Yinshu's Grotto Heaven, so it was the closest. Ever since the Kenshin established the Rebel Alliance, all kinds of news were flying around. The entire boundless heaven continent was abuzz with discussions. All the region masters were restless, and everyone was anxious. Only Qingfeng region was peaceful. There were no drastic actions, and there were no movements of people or troops. It was even difficult to guess what the region master of Qingfeng region was thinking based on the movements of Qingfeng region. Was he loyal to the Azura God Emperor, or was he leaning towards the Kenshin? No one knew. Therefore, The three forces made Qingfeng region their first target. They wanted to get off to a good start and hope for good luck. At least the region master of Qingfeng region was not a loyal supporter of the Azura God Emperor, so he might not resist much. When the 3,000 disciples of the Phoenix clan, Yuchi clan, and 100 Refinement's ancient sect rushed to Qingfeng region, they also sent a message to Ji Tianxing to report the situation. After Ji Tianxing received the news, he immediately sent a message to the Divine Phoenix clan leader. I will be waiting for you at Changshan region in 6 days. After sending the message, Ji Tianxing said to the White Dragon, speed up and head south to Jiuhe region. The White Dragon did not have any questions. He immediately steered the God-slaying battleship to speed up to the target. However, no one knew that Ji Tianxing would make such a decision. The three forces were going to attack Qingfeng region. He had agreed to meet them at Changshan region in 6 days. However, he asked the White Dragon to steer the God-slaying battleship to Jiuhe region. What did this mean? It meant that he had already guessed the result. It would not be difficult for the three forces to subdue the region master of Qingfeng region. Therefore, he had to subdue the region master of Jiuhe region alone in 6 days. He also had to rush to Changshan region. He was saving time by splitting up with the three forces and advancing side by side. If the three forces were to find out about this, who knew what their reactions would be? 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. The Phoenix clan, Yuchi clan, and 100 Refinement's ancient sect each set up a battleship and entered the central region of Qingfeng region. These three battleships were all King grade upper grade, and they were equipped with many defensive and offensive formations. They were the fruits of the efforts of the three forces. Along the way, they did not encounter any danger or ambush. It was a peaceful journey. However, when they entered the central region of Qingfeng region and approached the Qingfeng region master's cave residence, they slowed down and concealed their tracks and auras. At first, the Divine Phoenix clan leader suggested that they attack the Qingfeng region master's cave residence openly to show the power of the Rebel Alliance. However, the Yuchi clan and 100 Refinement's ancient sect strongly disagreed. They thought that it was too risky. If they were ambushed and attacked by the Qingfeng region master in advance, they would suffer great losses. It would be too embarrassing. This was their first operation. They would rather not be dazzling than make a fool of themselves. Therefore, the three battleships chose to hide their auras and keep a low profile. Finally, in the afternoon, the three battleships arrived outside the Qingfeng region master's cave residence. They observed for a while and confirmed that the defense of the cave residence was not strong, so they decided to launch a surprise attack. After a round of fighting, more than 30 guards were killed and more than 60 were injured. The remaining 100 or so guards covered the 60 or so wounded and retreated into the Immortal's Cave. The experts of the three forces appeared one after another and forcefully broke the defense array of the cave residence. They rushed in with great momentum. What they did not expect was that when they showed their flags and rushed into the cave residence, they did not encounter any large-scale resistance. They easily killed their way to the core of the cave residence and surrounded the Qingfeng region master's cave residence. They had no choice. He was just a region master and a seventh heaven realm high-level god king. The forces under him were limited. Even if the Qingfeng region master resisted with all his strength, he could not block the attacks of the three forces. Chapter 4106. The three forces had thought that the territorial lord would put up a symbolic resistance. At the very least, he would lead the soldiers to charge a few times and sacrifice some soldiers to show his loyalty to the Shura God Emperor. Then, he would choose to surrender, saying that the enemy was too powerful and he couldn't let his soldiers die in vain. That way, he could avoid too many casualties and preserve the strength of the territorial lord. At the same time, he could win the reputation of caring for his soldiers. Why not? But what the three forces didn't expect was, when they arrived at the residence of the precinct lord of Light Wind, the door to the magnificent palace opened. Hundreds of armored guards stood outside the residence, but they all maintained a dignified posture and didn't draw their swords to fight the enemy. When the gate of the palace opened, two messenger guards walked out of the main hall, and arrived in front of the three forces. After bowing respectfully, the two messenger guards said that the territorial lord invited the leaders of the three forces in for a talk. Such a scene caused the leaders of the three forces to be stunned. They were somewhat baffled. They looked at each other and thought to themselves, "What's going on? We're here to attack the territorial lord." Not only did he not resist, but he even opened the door to welcome us. The territorial lord surrendered without a fight? That's too unbelievable. He must be up to something. The three leaders felt that something was wrong and suspected that the territorial lord was up to something. Therefore, the three of them hesitated to enter the main hall. It wasn't until the two messenger guards urged them that the three of them said that they wanted to enter with the elders. Unexpectedly, the two messenger guards had a serious expression and solemn tone as they said that the region lord had instructed that only the three leaders were allowed to enter. The three leaders were conflicted. They all thought that the territorial lord was up to something. Perhaps the territorial lord had set up a trap in the main hall and was waiting for them to walk into it. In the end, the two messengers couldn't stand it any longer and mocked the three leaders with a few words. The Divine Phoenix clan leader, Yuchi clan leader, and Su Balian were embarrassed and angry. But then they thought about it. They represented the Rebel Alliance, and the Kenshin was behind the Rebel Alliance. If that was the case, it would be reasonable for the territorial lord of Light Wind to surrender. As for not allowing others to enter, it was probably because he was afraid of hurting his reputation. Therefore, the three leaders put away their bashful attitude and put on a confident and dignified posture as they walked side by side to the main hall. Of course, on the surface, they appear to be very confident and dignified, but in reality, the three of them were fully alert. If there were any unexpected situations or abnormalities, they would immediately leave the hall. The 3,000 disciples guarding outside the palace would also immediately launch an attack and raze everything within a 10,000-mile radius to the ground. Under such circumstances, the three leaders could not think of any reason why the territorial lord of Qingfeng would not surrender. Unless the territorial lord of Light Wind was a loyal follower of the Shura God Emperor, he would rather die with everyone than be humiliated and surrender. However, according to their investigation and the clues they had, the territorial lord of Clear Wind was clearly not such a person. Moments later, the three leaders entered the main hall and met with the territorial lord of Qingfeng. In the splendid, brightly lit hall, there was only the realm master of Light Wind and a few of his trusted guards. The atmosphere in the main hall was very cold and cheerless. It was exceptionally quiet. After the two sides met, they greeted each other hypocritically and exchanged a few pleasantries. The territorial lord of Light Wind, who was dressed like a middle-aged scholar, appeared gentle and elegant. After greeting everyone, he also expressed his respect and admiration for the Kenshin. Hearing this, the three leaders' hearts sank back into their stomachs. At least, the territorial lord of Light Wind had made his attitude clear. He was somewhat close to the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance. Then, the territorial lord of Light Wind invited the three leaders to sit down and drink tea. They could discuss things slowly. Now that the three leaders were emboldened, they appeared rather confident and dignified. After all, they represented the face of the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin. They could not be too weak. They had to appear strong. The Divine Phoenix clan leader said that the purpose of their visit was very simple. Everyone in the world knew, so the territorial lord of Light Wind did not have to pretend to be ignorant. As for sitting down and drinking tea, that was not necessary. After all, they were only here to inform the territorial lord of Light Wind. They just needed a sentence and an answer from the territorial lord of Light Wind. It was quickly settled. Patriarch Yuchi and Su Balian hurriedly agreed. They talked a lot about how the Shura God Emperor's rule was dark and cruel, and how he did not care about the lives of the people. Kenshin was the bright light in the dark night, the hope in the midst of despair. Only the Kenshin cared about the world and the survival of hundreds of millions of people. They were willing to take on the responsibility of saving the people. That was why they established the Rebel Alliance. Naturally, the ancient clans and forces would not sit by and do nothing. They were all moved by the Kenshin's magnanimity and joined the rebel alliance. Finally, they brought up the main topic and stated their intentions. They hoped that the territorial lord of Light Wind would be able to see the bigger picture and prioritize the lives of the people. They hoped that he would stop being stubborn and helping the Shura god emperor enslave the people. As long as the territorial lord of Light Wind realized his mistake and was willing to submit to the Kenshin and return to the right path, everyone would be gratified. The people would also be grateful for his good deeds. In fact, the three leaders' intentions were very simple. They hoped that the territorial lord of Light Wind would surrender to the rebel alliance and not become an enemy of the Kenshin. However, they said it in a more euphemistic way, making it sound hot-blooded, righteous, and generous. The territorial lord of Light Wind had already made up his mind. Previously, he had planned to appease the three leaders first. Then, he would follow his plan and carefully discuss his surrender step by step. However, the three leaders were so impatient and went straight to the point that he could not refuse. He could only show a conflicted, hesitant, and balanced expression. On the one hand, he sincerely expressed that he also cared about the people and did not want to see them suffer. On the other hand, he was, after all, the territorial lord appointed by the Shura god emperor. How could he be so treacherous? In short, the territorial lord of Light Wind revealed that he wanted to submit, but was unwilling to betray the Shura god emperor. The three leaders could see clearly that the territorial lord of Light Wind had made up his mind to surrender. It was just that he had not negotiated the terms and expectations. Seeing this, the three leaders did not beat around the bush and directly explain the pros and cons. If the territorial lord of Light Wind surrendered, he did not need to do anything. He only needed to read an oath of surrender. After Kenshin took control of the boundless heaven continent, he would still be the territorial lord of Light Wind. There would be no change. However, if he refused to surrender, there would be no room for negotiation. The Rebel Alliance would definitely kill him and choose another powerhouse to take control of the Qingfeng territory. In any case, there was no shortage of divine king powerhouses on this continent, nor was there a shortage of talents who could take control of a territory. The three leaders' attitudes were very tough. Patriarch Yuchi even took out a divine warship and a jade slip and handed it to the territorial lord of Light Wind. It was either war or surrender. The territorial lord of Light Wind, who had been pondering, weighing, and hesitating, was very tactful. He took the jade slip and began to read the oath of surrender. Chapter 4107. The territorial lord's tactfulness left the three leaders a little dumbfounded. They looked at each other and pondered for a moment before understanding the territorial lord's intentions. It was obvious that the realm lord of Light Wind had known that he would be targeted by the anti-rebels alliance. As the first territorial lord to be attacked by the rebel alliance, he would suffer a terrible fate if he resisted. In order to make an example out of him, the anti-rebellious alliance would most likely behead him in public to deter the domain masters of other domains. Unfortunately, his forces were weak and did not have the qualifications to fight against the rebel alliance. The imperial tutor could not even protect himself and could not send powerhouses and soldiers to reinforce him. If that was the case, he had to surrender to the Kenshin if he did not want to die. However, surrendering without a backbone would not only bring him no benefits, but he would also be ridiculed by the common people. Therefore, the territorial lord put on a welcoming posture and wanted to sit down and negotiate with the Kenshin. Unexpectedly, the Kenshin did not come. Only 3 forces came. Moreover, these 3 leaders represented the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance, and their attitudes were unusually tough. The territorial lord's plan failed, and he could not fall out with the Rebel Alliance, so he could only admit defeat. Even if the scene of him admitting defeat was not very honorable and would damage his reputation in the future, he could not care less. There were not many people in the hall anyway, so not many people knew about this. However, after he began to read the oath of surrender, he could no longer maintain his calm and poise. The nearly 1,000-word oath of surrender was basically swearing to the heavens, making all kinds of vows, and restricting and binding oneself. The general idea was to admit defeat to the Rebel Alliance and submit to the Kenshin. He would never betray them and follow the will of the Kenshin as his highest command. If he had any disloyalty, betrayed the Kenshin, or deliberately harmed the interests of the rebel alliance, he would be punished by the heavens. The more the territorial lord read, the more frightened he became. He felt more despair and regret. If he had known that he would have to make such a harsh pledge of surrender, he would have taken the risk and argued for all the benefits and conditions from the rebel alliance. Now, he was already halfway through his pledge of surrender. He was truly in a difficult position. If he gave up on reciting the oath of surrender now, he would have violated the first rule of the oath and would be punished by the heavens. Even if he was lucky enough to escape the wrath of the heavens, the leaders of the three forces would never agree to it. If they really fell out, he would be the one to suffer in the end. At the thought of this, the little bit of unwillingness in the territorial lord's heart disappeared. He obediently finished the oath of surrender, and his entire body lit up with divine light. A wisp of Taoist rhyme actually appeared on top of his head. In the depths of the firmament directly above the palace, there was even a sky full of lightning, and there were bursts of thunderous booms. Clearly, the heavenly Tao had already sensed his oath. Such a phenomenon proved that the vow to the heavenly Tao was valid. From now on, the territorial lord of Qingfeng was officially under Kenshin's command. He could not disobey him in the slightest. Otherwise, the heavenly Tao would punish him before the Kenshin and the rebel alliance did anything. So far, many experts have been forced by Ji Tianxing to make the vow to the heavenly Tao, but none of them have been punished by the heavens. However, Ji Tianxing did not think that the vow to the heavenly Tao was invalid. Those experts who had made the vow to the heavenly Tao would not dare to test the validity of the vow with their own lives. Similarly, when the territorial lord of Qingfeng saw the divine light around him, the Taoist rhyme above his head, and heard the thunderous booms deep in the firmament, he was also very afraid. He could clearly sense the vast and terrifying heavenly might. He no longer dared to have the slightest bit of hope. After the phenomenon of heaven and earth ended, he returned the jade slip to the Divine Phoenix clan leader. The Divine Phoenix clan leader put away the jade slip and saluted him. He said, as the saying goes, a wise man submits to circumstances. Territorial Lord of Qingfeng, you will definitely be grateful for the wise choice you made today. Since the matter has been settled, Territorial Lord of Qingfeng, please go ahead. We'll take our leave now. The three leaders did not forget that Ji Tianxing had given them a deadline of 6 days to meet in the Changshan territory. Now that half of the agreed time had passed, they could not delay any longer. They had to get to the Changshan territory as soon as possible. The territorial lord of Qingfeng frowned in confusion. He asked, "Everyone, does Kenshin not have any instructions for me?" He thought that since he had already joined the rebel alliance, Kenshin should at least give him some instructions or assign him some tasks, right? Unexpectedly, the three leaders shook their heads at the same time. The Yuchi clan leader explained, Territorial Lord of Qingfeng, you only need to maintain order in the Qingfeng territory and not let the people suffer from the chaos of war. If there are any tasks that you need to complete, the alliance leader will give you another order. The territorial lord of Qingfeng nodded in understanding and sighed in relief. In fact, he had mixed feelings. He hoped that Kenshin would give him some instructions, which at least meant that Kenshin was paying attention to him and had expectations of him. But he was also afraid that Kenshin would order him to gather elite soldiers and join the battle. In that case, he would have to risk his life fighting against the Shura God Emperor soldiers. It would be very dangerous. Fortunately, Kenshin did not give him any instructions. He was told to wait for orders, which was the best outcome. Seeing that the three leaders were about to turn and leave, he hurried to catch up with them. He said worriedly, "The three of you, I hope you can keep what happened today a secret. Don't spread it." He did not say the second half of the sentence, but everyone understood what he meant. If word got out, it would damage his image and reputation. The three patriarchs and the sect leader turned around to look at him, revealing a playful smile. Su Balian chuckled. Territorial Lord of Qingfeng will keep it a secret, and we will not spread it. But we came here in such a grandiose manner, and with so many people watching, this news can't be concealed. It will still spread." The territorial lord of Qingfeng waved his hand and said, "It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if the people know the result, as long as they don't know the details." "Of course not," Su Balian answered immediately. The Divine Phoenix clan leader said confidently, "Of course, we won't spread the news. You just need to take care of your trusted guards." The guards who stayed in the hall and witnessed the whole process were the territorial lord of Qingfeng's confidants. They would keep their mouths shut. Therefore, the territorial lord of Qingfeng's face and reputation would not be damaged too much. The gate of the palace opened. The territorial lord of Qingfeng personally saw the two clan leaders and Su Balian out. Soon, more than 3,000 soldiers from the three forces left the territorial lord's mansion. They drove 3 divine ships and rushed to the Changshan territory. It would take at least 2.5 days to travel from the Qingfeng territory to the center of the Changshan territory. By the time they found the territorial lord's cave residence, the 3-day deadline would be up. Therefore, the 3 divine battleships were operating at full power. They traveled as fast as they could, not daring to delay at all. Chapter 4108. Just as the 3 forces were leaving the Clear Wind Domain Chief's manor, White Dragon's god-slaying warship had just entered the 9 Union region. There was no choice. When Ji Tianxing intercepted Qi Yin in the north, he was very far away from here. If it were the forces of the Rebel Alliance, they would need at least 7 to 8 days to rush back. For the god-slaying warship to reach the 9 Union region in 3 days, its speed was already unparalleled. At the same time, the news of the patrol commander Qi Yin and his 2,000 soldiers being intercepted by Qin Shin also spread throughout the Boundless Heaven continent. After the news spread, it caused a huge sensation in the Boundless Heaven continent. Various forces, countless experts, and hundreds of millions of citizens were all discussing it enthusiastically. Everyone was shocked and in awe of Qin Shin's speed and valiant means. At the same time, the citizens were more favorable and more confident in the Rebel Alliance. Everyone was looking forward to when Qin Shin could get rid of the Imperial Tutor and restore peace to the Boundless Heaven continent. Of course, with the previous incident of Qin Shin intercepting Meng Shuai, everyone no longer doubted the authenticity of the news when they heard that Qi Yin was intercepted. The shock that this news brought to everyone also lessened by a lot. In everyone's opinion, Qi Yin was just a 9th-degree realm divine king. Even the peak divine king Meng Shuai was killed by Qin Shin, so Qi Yin's death was only natural. The reason why everyone was discussing this matter was not to praise Qin Shin's strength or how powerful he was. Instead, everyone felt that Qin Shin's whereabouts were erratic, appearing and disappearing unpredictably. It was simply impossible to guard against him. Everyone wanted to know how Qin Shin could travel across half of the Boundless Heaven continent in such a short period of time to hunt targets everywhere. Moreover, how did he know the other party's route? Many people speculated that Qin Shin must have mastered an extremely profound technique to deduce the heavens and could see the future. There was also a portion of people who thought that Qin Shin must have planted a spy under the Imperial Tutor to find out the inside story. Other than these 2 widely circulated theories, there were many other guesses. However, the vast majority of people still believed in these 2 statements. More people were leaning towards the latter. They felt that the Qin Shin was extremely shrewd and had long planted spies under the Imperial Tutor. After this rumor spread, the Imperial Tutor's soldiers quickly learned about it, causing them to be anxious and suspicious of each other. Even the Imperial Tutor was suspicious and vigilant when he heard the news. It was late at night again, in the 9 Union region, in an alternate space hidden in the sea of clouds. This alternate space with a radius of more than 100,000 miles couldn't be called a blessed place, but a secret realm. Fortunately, the environment in the mystic realm was very beautiful, and the divine power of heaven and earth was also very abundant. Therefore, since thousands of years ago, this place had been built into the abode of powerhouses. For nearly 1,000 years, the 9 Region Lord had been living here. There were nearly 100 guards guarding the entrance of the cave, and there were also more than 10,000 soldiers and guards, as well as the domain lord's relatives, living inside the cave. In the past few months, even if the Nine Union region was peaceful and there were no official matters to deal with, the Nine Union region lord did not cultivate in isolation. He had been paying attention to the movements of the outside world. Naturally, he knew that the Kenshin had established the rebel alliance, and that Jin Shuang and Meng Shuai had been intercepted and killed. Today, he also learned that the patrol commander Qi Yin had been intercepted and killed by the Kenshin. At this time, he was still sitting in the study, discussing important military matters with the deputy region lord and two heavenly generals. Under the dim yellow light, his expression was very serious. His brows were knitted together, and he seemed to have a lot on his mind and was full of worries. Although the deputy region lord and the two heavenly generals were comforting him and persuading him that the Kenshin had intercepted and killed Commander Qi Yin in the north and had not yet returned to Yenshu's Grotto Heaven, the Nine Union region should be safe. However, the Nine Union region lord's mood was not relaxed at all, and he did not listen to the three's persuasion. Now, there are only a few powerhouses left under the God Emperor to guard the boundless heaven continent. The imperial tutor is alone, and the people of the 100 territories are divided. I'm afraid that this time, the world is going to be turned upside down. The Nine Union region lord said earnestly, Kenshin has just killed Qi Yin, and now he has two choices. The first is to continue to the north and assassinate the imperial tutor. As long as he kills the imperial tutor, the 100 territories will be leaderless, and the rebel alliance will win without a fight. However, the imperial tutor's headquarters in the Dark Knight region is surrounded by countless powerhouses, and it will be very difficult to assassinate him. The second choice is to return to Yenshu's Grotto Heaven and lead the rebel alliance's army to conquer the various territories. The deputy region lord and the two heavenly generals heard and said in unison, Kenshin will most likely choose the second option to be safe. The Nine Union region lord nodded and said, That's right. The safest and most honorable way is to lead the rebel alliance to conquer the various territories and finally encircle and kill the imperial tutor. Therefore, we don't have much time left, and we have to make a choice as soon as possible. The deputy region lord frowned and said, We reported this to the imperial tutor 10 days ago and asked for reinforcements. However, the imperial tutor's general replied that the various territories are asking for reinforcements, and there is no military force to support us. If the rebel alliance's army comes, we can't stop them with our little power. The Nine Union region lord nodded slightly and said with a serious face, Not only that, I also received a top-secret message today. A few forces of the rebel alliance left Yenshu's Grotto Heaven a few days ago, and they set off in two different directions. What? I thought Kenshin hasn't returned to Yenshu's Grotto Heaven yet? Why did they start earlier? The two heavenly generals were shocked, and their faces changed drastically. The Nine Union region lord sneered. With Kenshin's prestige, does he need to return to Yenshu's Grotto Heaven personally to give an order? He just needs to send a message and announce an order. Who dares to disobey? The deputy region lord and the two heavenly generals were silent, and their hearts were heavy. One of the heavenly generals still had hope and said, Even if the rebel alliance's army has started to move, they will start from the nearest few territories, such as Qingfeng territory and Changshan territory. The rebel alliance will conquer those two territories first and then attack us, right? This was also the deputy region lord and the other heavenly general's thoughts, and both of them nodded subconsciously. However, the Nine Union region lord sneered and said in a low voice, Kenshin has always been elusive, accurate, and fast. The rebel alliance's army set off a few days ago, and I guess Changshan territory and Qingfeng territory have already changed hands? I'm afraid it will be our turn in 2 days at the latest. His tone was so certain that the deputy region lord and the two heavenly generals could not refute him, and they froze on the spot. What should we do, region lord? The Nine Union region lord looked at the three of them and said in a serious tone, Tonight, everyone must come to a consensus and make a choice. Do we surrender or do we fight? The deputy region lord and the two heavenly generals looked at each other, and their expressions were somewhat bitter. The deputy region lord smiled bitterly and asked, "Can't we avoid the brunt of the attack and go into hiding for a few years?" The 9 Union region lord sneered. "Give the 9 Union region to Kenshin? Might as well surrender." Chapter 4109. Of course, running away was unrealistic. There were only two choices in front of everyone: surrender or resist. After a moment of silence, the deputy region master and the two heavenly generals raised their heads at the same time and said in unison, "Then surrender." They all knew their limits. With their strength and manpower, they would be digging their own graves if they really fought the Rebel Alliance's army. Being loyal to the Azura God Emperor was important, but their own lives were the most important. In any case, the Imperial Tutor would not send reinforcements at this critical juncture. Even if they chose to surrender, they would not have any psychological burden. They would even feel a sense of relief from the fact that they had been heartless. Seeing that the Deputy Region Master and the two Heavenly Generals had made their choice, the Ninefold Region Master no longer hesitated. She nodded and said, "If that's the case, then surrender. There's no shame in losing to the Rebel Alliance and surrendering to the Kenshin. It's not just us. I'm afraid no one in the entire Boundless Heaven continent is a match for the Kenshin. Even the Imperial Tutor has no chance of winning against the Kenshin. So, it's pardonable for us to surrender, isn't it?" Perhaps she was afraid that the atmosphere would be awkward, so the Ninefold Region Master explained a lot to absolve herself. The Deputy Region Master and the two Heavenly Generals hurriedly nodded in agreement. At first, they were a little ashamed, afraid that the news would spread and they would be laughed at by the people. After hearing the Ninefold Region Master's words, they felt more at ease. Next, the four of them prepared to discuss how to surrender to the Rebel Alliance, how to negotiate with the other party, and what conditions to put forward. Surrendering was surrendering, but they still had to discuss the conditions that should be discussed and the benefits that should be obtained. However, at this moment, the door of the study suddenly opened. With a soft creak, the door opened as if it had been blown open by a gust of wind. The Ninefold Region Master, the Deputy Region Master, and the two Heavenly Generals were all shocked and instinctively turned to look at the door. When they entered the study to discuss matters, they had clearly closed the door of the study and activated the defensive formation. Not to mention being blown open by the wind. Even if the guards forced the door open, it would not be able to open it. At this moment, the same thought appeared in everyone's minds at the same time. Could it be that a powerhouse broke into the cave residence to assassinate us? But when everyone thought about it, that didn't seem right either. If there really was an expert who came to assassinate us, they would have been discovered long ago. There should also be sounds of fighting outside. That is, unless the person who came is very strong, and the guards and hidden sentries we set up didn't discover him. At the thought of this, the hearts of the four divine kings were raised, and they subconsciously took out their divine weapons. At the same time, a white light flashed, and the door of the study closed with a bang. The four of them were frightened and stood up subconsciously. They only saw a blur in front of their eyes before a figure appeared in the study. It was a handsome young man in a white robe who exuded an invisible pressure and aura. Even though this young man did not have a trace of killing intent, and his expression and eyes were very calm as he looked at them. However, the four of them were filled with fear. It was as if they had fallen into an ice cellar, and their bodies were cold. Their expressions changed drastically, and their eyes widened in fear. Even their hands began to tremble. Among the four of them, only the Ninefold Region Master was relatively calm. No matter how nervous and frightened he was, at least he didn't lose his composure. Kenshin, after a moment, the four of them calmed down a lot, and the Ninefold Region Master tried to ask. In fact, they had not seen Kenshin with their own eyes, but they had seen Kenshin's portrait and heard many descriptions of Kenshin's appearance. They already had an answer in their hearts. They were 80% sure that the white-robed young man in front of them was Kenshin. However, they still had to ask to confirm the other party's identity. Ji Tianxing did not answer the Ninefold Region Master. Instead, he took out a jade slip and threw it in front of the Ninefold Region Master. He said calmly, "Since you've decided to surrender, then recite the oath of surrender." Seeing his reaction, the ninefold Region Master and the other three were basically sure that the white-robed young man was Kenshin. At the same time, they also understood that their previous conversation had been heard by Kenshin a long time ago. When they thought of this, the four of them felt even more ashamed and humiliated. Fortunately, other than that sentence, Kenshin did not say anything else, nor did he mock or humiliate them. Kenshin only looked at the ninefold Region Master quietly and waited patiently. The study was very quiet, and the atmosphere was somewhat awkward and depressing. The Deputy Region Master and the two Divine Generals did not know what to do. They all looked at the ninefold Region Master and waited for him to make a decision. The ninefold Region Master looked at the jade slip on the table and hesitated for a moment. However, he did not reach out to take it. He mustered up his courage and looked at Ji Tianxing. He tried to say, "Kenshin, everyone knows that you are very powerful. Naturally, we're no match for you. However, we are the subjects of the Shura God Emperor after all. We cannot surrender to the Rebel Alliance for no reason. There has to be an explanation." The ninefold Region Master was still dilly-dallying, thinking about how to phrase it. However, before he could finish speaking, Ji Tianxing interrupted him. Ji Tianxing glanced at him and said coldly, "You want to discuss terms with me?" The ninefold Region Master was at a loss for words. He did not know how to answer. He also did not expect Kenshin to be so direct. He did not know how to respond. Without waiting for him to answer, Ji Tianxing continued, "You are not qualified to discuss terms with me. There are only two choices in front of you. You can either surrender or die." After saying this, Ji Tianxing released an invisible pressure that enveloped the entire study. Suddenly, the ninefold Region Master and the others found it difficult to breathe. The circulation of their divine power was also slowed and blocked. A haze of fear covered their hearts. The entire study was sealed off by Ji Tianxing's invisible aura, so they could not call for help. Even if they shouted themselves hoarse, the guards outside the study would not be able to hear them. Moreover, the four of them knew that Kenshin was very powerful. If they desperately called for help, they were afraid that Kenshin would kill them instantly before the guards could come to their rescue. Therefore, the four of them wisely chose to shut up and gave up on the idea of calling for help. After all, they were the most powerful people. It was not realistic to expect the 2,000 to 3,000 divine lords to save them. Looking at the situation before them, Kenshin was certain to defeat them. Moreover, they did not doubt Kenshin's determination and methods at all. Kenshin had killed powerful people like Lian Jinshuang, Qi Yin, and Meng Shuai without batting an eyelid. For small fries like them, if they really angered the sword god, it would be as simple as crushing a few ants. Thinking of this, the Deputy Region Master and the two Divine Generals were a little anxious. They looked at the ninefold Region Master and used their eyes to tell him to stop hesitating and digging his own grave. Quickly admit defeat and surrender to Kenshin. It will be good for you, good for me, and good for everyone. If we really angered the sword god and casually killed a few of us, then our deaths would be too aggrieved. The ninefold Region Master saw the meaning in their eyes. His heart was filled with sadness and despair. Helplessly, he held on for less than 10 seconds before bowing his head to Ji Tianxing. "Kenshin, please calm down. I admit defeat and surrender to you." Chapter 41:10. The ninefold Region Master chose to lower his head, admit defeat, and surrender. This meant that he had given up on the illusion of negotiation and abandoned the dignity and reputation of a Region Master. This was because he understood that the dignity and reputation of a Region Master were not worth mentioning in the eyes of Kenshin. Moreover, dignity and reputation were insignificant when compared to life. Surviving was the most important thing. He obediently picked up the jade slip and began to recite the oath of surrender in front of Ji Tianxing, the Deputy Region Master, and the two heavenly generals. However, his expression and reaction seemed to be a little sullen. After reading the oath of surrender, not only him, but even the Deputy Region Master and the two heavenly generals felt even more sullen. However, The ninefold Region Master had already destroyed his wishful thinking and decided to surrender. He would not hesitate anymore. No matter how harsh the contents of the oath of surrender were, he could only bite the bullet and continue reading. The Deputy Region Master and the two heavenly generals felt their scalps tingle and chills run down their spines when they heard the series of oaths to the heavens and all kinds of willing to be punished by the heavens. As for the ninefold Region Master, while feeling humiliated and indignant, he actually had a different thought. He was thinking that the Qingfeng Region Master and the Changshan Region Master must have also recited the same oath of surrender not long ago, right? He wondered how those two fellows felt when they recited the oath of surrender. Are you also very shocked, sullen, and unwilling to accept this? When he thought of the two Region Masters being defeated, the ninefold Region Master was actually not so sad and indignant. He also felt much better. In a short while, he finished reciting the oath of surrender. The Deputy Region Master and the two heavenly generals had just breathed a sigh of relief when they saw the ninefold Region Master's entire body lit up with five-color divine light. A wisp of Taoist rhyme appeared above his head. At the same time, in the sky above the study, tens of thousands of lightning bolts lit up, and there was the sound of heavenly thunder. It was obvious that the oath of the heavenly Tao had been established. The ninefold Region Master could clearly sense that the terrifying heavenly might was enveloping him. It was as if the heavens were watching him all the time. If he dared to have any thoughts of betrayal and violate any of the terms of the oath, he would immediately be punished by the heavens. When this thought flashed through his mind, the ninefold Region Master shuddered. Although the Deputy Region Master and the two heavenly generals did not understand what was going on, they had a premonition that the matter was very serious. They immediately felt a trace of sympathy for the ninefold Region Master. A moment later, the phenomenon disappeared. The Nine Region Lord respectfully returned the jade slip to Ji Tianxing. Since he had already surrendered and pledged his allegiance to Qin Shin, he no longer harbored any illusions. He respectfully said, "Qin Shin, Sama, this subordinate has sincerely surrendered. From now on, I will be Lord Qin Shin's lackey. If there is anything you need, please do not hesitate to tell me." Ji Tianxing put away the jade slip and said expressionlessly, "Guard the Nine Union region well, and don't let the people suffer the pain of war." In addition, the enslavement of the common people was to be stopped immediately and their freedom restored. If there is anything else, I will send another order to inform you. After that, Ji Tianxing turned around and pushed open the door of the study, his figure disappearing into the darkness. The Nine Unity Region Master and the other three hurriedly walked to the door of the study and respectfully sent Ji Tianxing off. After Ji Tianxing had disappeared for a long time, the four of them finished their salutes and silently returned to the study. The door of the study closed again. It was also very quiet outside, as if nothing had happened. The four of them were silent for a long time. In order to ease the awkwardness, the Deputy Region Lord said, "I have always heard about how extraordinary Qin Shin's demeanor is. After seeing it with my own eyes tonight, the rumors are indeed true." The two heavenly generals hurriedly nodded in agreement and praised, as expected of Qin Shin, not to mention his appearance and temperament. Just his pressure and aura alone are superior to that of any god king. In this world, I'm afraid that other than the five god emperors, no one can compete with Qin Shin. For insignificant characters like us to be able to see Qin Shin in person and come out unscathed, that is also an amazing thing. The Deputy Region Lord and the two heavenly generals desperately flattered Qin Shin, calling him the most powerful person below the five god emperors. Their purpose was to show that their side's surrender to Qin Shin was pardonable and understandable. Not to mention that they had to surrender to Qin Shin. Any other god king would not be able to withstand Qin Shin's pressure. Therefore, it was only natural for them to admit defeat, surrender, and recite the humiliating oath of surrender. Sure enough, the ninefold region Lord's expression eased a lot. He stopped talking about this topic and muttered to himself, "I really didn't expect the sword god's speed to be so fast." I just received news today that he had intercepted and killed Commander Qi Yan in the north. As a result, he came to the Ninefold region tonight. Such speed is unparalleled in the world, and no one can match him." The deputy region lord and the two heavenly generals hurriedly nodded in agreement. The Ninefold region lord continued, "I have thought many times about what to do after meeting Kenshin. I did not expect it to be in such a way. Ha! Even admitting defeat and surrendering was done so carelessly. More importantly, Kenshin did not take me seriously at all. He did not even give me any instructions, let alone assign me any tasks." At this point, the Ninefold region lord laughed self-deprecatingly. The deputy region lord hurriedly comforted him and said, "Your Excellency, Kenshin's speed shows that he is very busy. Naturally, he would not waste time. Moreover, it is not just you. The Changshan region lord and the Qingfeng region lord must have received the same treatment. If you don't believe me, you can see what they will do in the future." The two heavenly generals also comforted the Ninefold region lord and said, "Your Excellency, didn't Kenshin assign you a task?" "That's right. Kenshin asked you to save the people of the Ninefold region and return their freedom. This is a great good deed and merit. When the time comes, millions of people will be deeply grateful to you." Hearing this, the Ninefold region lord's eyes lit up, and he was in high spirits. At the very least, he had found something to do and could prove that he was of value. Since he had pledged allegiance to Kenshin, he naturally hoped to make some achievements and win Kenshin's favor. After leaving the Ninefold region lord's cave residence, Ji Tianxing asked Bai Long to drive the deity-slaying battleship to the Changshan region. At the same time, he also sent 2 messages to ask about the Divine Phoenix clan leader, Yuqi clan leader, and Su Balian's movements, as well as the progress of Nangong Buhua and the others. In less than 15 minutes, the Divine Phoenix clan leader was the first to send back a message. They reported to Ji Tianxing that they had subdued the Qingfeng region lord and forced him to swear the oath of surrender. The process was very smooth. At the moment, they were leaving the Qingfeng region and were on their way to the Changshan region. After a while, Nangong Buhua also sent back a message to report to Ji Tianxing. The 6 forces had already started their operation and had successfully subdued a region lord in the south of Yanchu's cave heaven. The region lord was already mentally prepared and was in awe of Kenshin. Therefore, when Nangong Buhua and the others found the region lord, they did not encounter any strong resistance. The region lord naturally surrendered. Chapter 4111. Up until now, the Rebel Alliance had split into 3 operations, and everything was going smoothly. The main reason was that the few territories they attacked were all around Yanchu's grotto heaven. These territorial rulers had expected that the Rebel Alliance would attack them first. Therefore, 10 days ago, they had sent a message to the Imperial Tutor asking for help. Unfortunately, the Imperial Tutor could not even take care of himself. He was busy deploying his troops to carry out his plan. How could he spare the manpower to help the territories? When the territorial rulers saw that the Imperial Tutor was not helping, they had the thought that they did not have to be loyal to the Imperial Tutor and the Azura God Emperor. Since you don't care about our lives, you have nothing to complain about when we surrender and betray you. With this thought in mind, when the Rebel Alliance came knocking on their door, they surrendered without hesitation. Ji Tianxing encouraged Nangong Buhua and the others and asked them to continue with the original plan and not be careless. Nangong Buhua sent a message back saying that he would be cautious and was rushing to the next territory. 1 day later, Ji Tianxing was the first to arrive at the Changshan territory. The Phoenix tribe, Yuqi tribe, and Hundred Refinement Ancient sect had yet to enter the Changshan territory. Even if they rushed over as fast as they could, it would still take them 1.5 days to meet up with Ji Tianxing. Seeing this, Ji Tianxing decisively went to the Changshan territory ruler's cave residence alone to force him to surrender. He sent a message to the Phoenix tribe, Yuqi tribe, and Hundred Refinement Ancient sect, saying that he had already subdued the Ninefold territory ruler and that they did not need to rush to the Changshan territory. When the Divine Phoenix tribe leader and the others received the message, they were shocked and could not believe it. A few days ago, Ji Tianxing was still trying to kill Qi Yan in the north. Yesterday, Ji Tianqing had already subdued the ninefold territory ruler. Now, before they could reach the Changshan territory, Ji Tianqing had already arrived. Not to mention the fact that Ji Tianqing alone had the confidence to subdue the Changshan territorial lord. Just his unparalleled speed was enough to stun everyone. The god kings and disciples of the three forces were completely convinced of Ji Tianqing's power and felt even more reverence for him. With regards to Ji Tianqing's orders, they did not dare to delay in the slightest. They hurriedly changed their direction and headed to the next area. They only had 3 divine warships and 3,000 soldiers. However, with their previous experience and the might of the Rebel Alliance and the Kenshin, they were fearless. This time, they were all full of energy. They wanted to rush to the next domain as quickly as possible and subdue the domain lord. They also wanted the sword god to look at them in a different light and recognize their efficiency. For the same reason, Nangong Buhua and the others who were marching on the other side had the same thought. Ji Tianqing didn't think too much about it. He stayed in the distorted space-time and meditated, nourishing his foundation of the divine path and continuing to refine the godhead fragments of the god kings. Last time, he still had more than 40 godhead fragments to refine. After killing Qi Yin, he obtained another 40 godhead fragments. He would probably be busy refining those godhead fragments for a long time. The god-slaying battleship was super fast. It took less than a day to cover a distance that a king-level divine warship would take 2 days to cover. A day later, the god-slaying battleship arrived at the Changshan territory and found the Changshan territorial lord's residence. It was a group of palaces floating in the sea of clouds. There were many divine arrays protecting it, as well as a large group of elite guards and many god kings. At this time, Ji Tianqing had been in seclusion in the distorted space-time for 50 days and refined another 10 godhead fragments. Even though he still had more than 70 godhead fragments, he could only put them aside and deal with the Changshan territorial lord first. The night was dark, and there were few stars in the night sky. At the peak of the white sea of clouds, the majestic palaces flickered with golden light in the dark night. It was very dazzling. Ji Tianqing put away the god-slaying battleship when he was still tens of thousands of miles away. He stepped through the sea of clouds alone, silently approaching the group of palaces. He concealed his whereabouts and aura. Even when he arrived at the square outside the palaces, the patrolling guards did not notice him. The Changshan territorial lord was probably the same as the other territorial lords. He had expected that the Rebel Alliance would attack him. Therefore, the defense of the palaces was very tight. Even the number of patrolling guards was higher than usual. The defensive formations all over the palace complex were also in an activated state, and they could be considered to be on full alert. However, these did not pose a threat to Ji Tianqing. They also could not stop him from sneaking into the palaces. He first released his divine sense, and used his divine sense to investigate the situation in the palaces. After about 100 breaths, he had a sufficient understanding of the situation in the palaces. There were more than 15,000 people living in the palaces. Among them, there were more than 4,000 monarch god experts. Most of them were guards. There were more than 10 god king experts. Among them, there was only one 6th heaven realm god king. Ji Tianqing locked onto the 6th heaven realm god king's aura. He carefully compared it with the Changshan territorial lord's information and confirmed that he was the Changshan territorial lord. Before he came, he was worried that the Changshan territorial lord would make a mistake and run away. If that was the case, it would be troublesome for him to subdue the Changshan territorial lord. Fortunately, the Changshan territorial lord did not do such a stupid thing. This saved Ji Tianqing a lot of time and effort. He remained invisible and quietly passed through several layers of defensive arrays. He sneaked into the palaces. Along the way, he successfully avoided many patrolling guards and more than 10 hidden sentries. He went straight into the depths of the palaces. In the middle of the palaces, the most majestic palace was the Changshan territorial lord's residence. It was also the main hall where he usually held meetings. However, the Changshan territorial lord was very cautious. He did not live there. Instead, He hid in an inconspicuous palace in the depths of the palaces. At this moment, the Changshan territorial lord was in the study, discussing matters with a few of his trusted generals. He had 5 trusted subordinates. Other than the deputy territorial lord, there were 3 god generals and a governor. It was not known what they were discussing in low voices. Everyone's expression was very solemn. The dim light in the study shone on the Changshan territorial lord's face. It made him frown and ponder. It made him look even more haggard. Perhaps it was because they were discussing an important issue. The few of them fell silent, looking helpless and dejected. At this moment, Ji Tianxing was like a transparent ghost. He passed through the layers of barriers and hidden sentries and arrived outside the study. He stopped to listen for a moment. When he saw that there was no movement in the study, he knew that the Changshan territorial lord and the others had not made up their minds. However, he did not want to waste any time. He raised his hand and shot out a few rays of divine light. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. In a split second, the 4 guards who were 10 steps away were knocked unconscious by the divine light. Their bodies fell slowly. They were about to hit the ground, making a loud noise. However, before they fell, Ji Tianxing waved his hand and shot out a vast amount of divine power. It formed a light shield with a radius of 1,000 feet and covered the entire palace. Even if the 4 guards fell to the ground and made muffled thuds, it would not alarm the people outside the light shield. However, the Changshan territorial lord and the others in the study were immediately alarmed. Chapter 41:12. The Changshan territorial lord and the others were startled when they heard the commotion outside the study and sensed the fluctuation of divine power. Their expressions changed at the same time. Without any hesitation, they drew out their divine weapons and held them in their hands. They then let out a furious roar. "Who's there?" As soon as they roared, they sensed an invisible, majestic divine power sealing off the entire palace. Then, they heard the thuds of 4 guards falling to the ground. The few divine kings were all people with abundant experience and immediately realized that there was a powerful enemy attacking. They spread out and occupied every corner of the study. They stared at the door warily. No one opened the door of the study to avoid being attacked by a powerful enemy. They all stared at the door of the study, secretly accumulating their divine power, ready to unleash a thunderous attack at any moment. After 2 short breaths, the door of the study was indeed pushed open. A white figure appeared at the door and stepped into the study calmly. The Changshan territorial lord and the others immediately focused on the white-robed young man. When the crowd saw his appearance clearly and sensed his divine power, aura, and pressure, their expressions changed instantly. They were extremely shocked and terrified. Although they had never seen Kenshin with their own eyes, they knew that the white-robed young man was Kenshin the moment they saw him. They were just discussing how to deal with the Rebel Alliance's upcoming attack, how to face Kenshin and negotiate with Kenshin. They did not expect that Kenshin would come to them before they could come to a conclusion. He came so quickly and so suddenly that they were caught off guard. For a moment, the Changshan territorial lord and the others were stunned. They stared blankly as Kenshin walked into the study. They did not make a sound or move. It was not until Kenshin walked to the large desk and sat down that the Changshan territorial lord and the others came back to their senses. They looked at each other and saw the panic and nervousness in each other's eyes, as well as deep worry. Ji Tianxing sat down casually. He glanced at everyone indifferently and finally fixed his gaze on the Changshan territorial lord. "What? Aren't you going to say hello to me?" This was unreasonable. He was the one who had barged into the Changshan territorial lord's residence in the middle of the night, uninvited, and barged into his study. Instead of greeting the other party, he asked the other party to greet him. They had gone too far. But who was he? He's a Kenshin. The Changshan domain lord and the others didn't find anything wrong with it, nor did they get angry over it. The main thing was that he did not dare to do so. Cough, cough. No, I'm the Changshan territorial lord. Greetings to Lord Kenshin. The Changshan territorial governor quickly calmed himself down and tried his best to remain calm. He bowed solemnly. The deputy domain master, 3 divine generals, and 1 governor also came to their senses. They hurriedly followed the example of the Changshan domain master and bowed to Ji Tianqing. Ji Tianqing nodded slightly to express his satisfaction. Without further ado, he took out a jade slip and threw it in front of the Changshan territorial lord. Since you are already discussing the matter of surrendering, make a decision now. I'll give you 10 breaths of time. Once you've made up your mind, you can recite the oath of surrender. If you haven't thought it through, then don't think about it anymore. Hearing the last sentence, the Changshan territorial lord and the others trembled. Fear flashed in their eyes. Although the sword god said it casually, there was no killing intent. But everyone felt a chill down their spines. They felt terrified and helpless from the bottom of their hearts. Because they knew that Qin Shin's attitude was so calm, because Qin Shin had never regarded them as opponents. Everyone was in the same study. If Qin Shin wanted to kill them, it would be as easy as lifting a finger. Therefore, they only had two choices: either submit or die. The Changshan territorial lord and the others were never impassioned, hot-blooded men who were brave enough to sacrifice themselves. On the contrary, old foxes like them, who had lived for more than 10,000 years, cherished their lives more than anyone else. The two choices that Ji Tianqing threw out, in fact, did not seem like a choice to them. They already had an answer. Naturally, they would choose to admit defeat and surrender to save their lives. However, the Changshan territorial lord frowned and thought for a moment. He mustered his courage and asked, "Lord Qin Shin, we admire your courage to rise in rebellion for the sake of the people of the boundless heaven continent. But after all, I am a subject of the Azura God Emperor. If you don't give me a suitable price, it will be very difficult for me to surrender just like that." Ji Tianqing was slightly surprised. He did not expect the Changshan territorial lord to be so bold and thick-skinned to speak so directly. Without waiting for the Changshan territorial lord to finish speaking, he sneered and said indifferently, "Price? Surrender, and you will keep your life. You will still be the Changshan territorial lord in the future. If you don't, you will die immediately. Is that suitable?" As his voice fell, an invisible murderous aura spread throughout the study. Immediately, the Changshan territorial lord, the deputy territorial lord, the three divine generals, and the governor all shuddered. Fear filled their eyes. At that moment, they even felt the aura of death descending. They had long known that Qin Shin was very powerful, but this was the first time they experienced that a divine king could be so powerful that they could not even muster the will to resist. They had no doubt that if Qin Shin attacked, they would not even have the chance to call for help or escape. They would die instantly. Since the difference in strength between the two sides was so great, what right did they have to bargain with Qin Shin? At that thought, the Changshan territorial lord did not waste any more time. He quickly took the jade slip with both hands and began to read the oath of surrender. The 1,000-word oath of surrender stunned the Changshan territorial lord. After he finished reading the first oath, his expression changed drastically. His eyes were filled with disbelief and humiliation. The deputy territorial lord, the three divine generals, and the governor also felt that the situation was not right. They all wanted to see the contents of the jade slip to see what the oath of surrender was. Ji Tianqing looked coldly at the Changshan territorial lord. An invisible pressure enveloped him. The Changshan territorial lord could not back down. After swallowing a few times, he could only force himself to continue reading. The result was predictable. As oath after oath appeared, his expression became uglier and uglier. He was sweating profusely. The deputy territorial lord, the three divine generals, and the governor were also shocked and aggrieved. Their hearts were filled with unwillingness. In the end, when the Changshan territorial lord finished reading the oath of surrender, his heart was dead. He was filled with despair. His entire body lit up with five-color divine light. A wisp of Taoist rhyme appeared above his head. Deep in the sky above the study, muffled thunder rumbled. The oath of the heavenly Tao had been completed. The Changshan territorial lord also sensed the mighty heavenly Tao's might, forming an invisible connection with him. He realized that the heavenly Tao had witnessed those oaths. If he dared to violate any of the oaths, he would be punished by the heavens. In other words, Qin Shi did not have to monitor him or pay attention to him. He had to maintain his loyalty to Qin Shi because of the heavenly Tao's supervision and deterrence. Such an outcome left only one thought in the Changshan territorial lord's mind. Too vicious, too ruthless. Chapter 41:13. The Changshan territorial lord stood rooted to the ground, a little dazed. Although he had surrendered to Ji Tianxing, he did not flatter him, nor did he ask for Ji Tianxing's instructions. She just stood there like that, as if she had nothing left to live for. Ji Tianxing put away the jade slip, glanced at him, and said expressionlessly, "Other than being loyal to me, you haven't changed at all. You don't have to look like you're seeking death. From now on, all the people of the Changshan territory will be free, and their enslavement will be stopped. Other than that, if I have any tasks for you, I will send you an order." After that, Ji Tianxing got up and left the study, disappearing into the night. The Changshan territorial lord was still rooted to the ground. The deputy territorial lord, the 3 divine generals, and the governor hurried to the door of the study, bowed to the night sky, and respectfully sent Ji Tianxing off. After a long time, when Ji Tianxing was far away, the 4 of them returned to the study. The Changshan territorial lord had also come to his senses, and he sat on the chair with a dejected expression. Everyone hurried to comfort him and enlighten him. "Territorial lord, actually, we all support your decision. It's no big deal to surrender to Qin Shi. If you don't believe me, just watch. The territorial lords of the surrounding territories will definitely surrender." That's right. Even the imperial tutor may not be Qin Shi's match. It's normal for us to surrender. Territorial lord, you chose to surrender for the sake of the people of the Changshan territory. The people will definitely understand you. After hearing everyone's words of comfort, the Changshan territorial lord felt much better. He said in a low voice, "I understand what you're saying. I don't care about these things. I just feel that I haven't reaped any benefits, and I've surrendered in such a muddle-headed manner. It's really sullen. Moreover, I've made so many oaths, and I'm still under the supervision of the heavenly Tao. From now on, I can only be loyal to Qin Shi. There are no other choices or possibilities. If the Sword God's rebellion fails, I can only accompany him in death." It turned out that the reason why the Changshan domain master felt aggrieved and helpless was that he had lost his freedom and choice. If he could remain neutral, he could wait for the right price and obtain more benefits in the future. However, due to his vow to the heavenly Tao, he could only be loyal to Qin Shi, so there was no possibility of that happening. The deputy region master, the 3 heavenly generals, and the governor looked at each other and tried to comfort him. "Since there is no other choice, we can only pray that Qin Shi succeeds." That's right. Looking at the current situation, as long as the Azure God Emperor doesn't return, Qin Shi sweeping through the entire boundless heaven continent is practically a done deal. The few of them whispered in the study for a while. Not long after, the Changshan domain lord finally untied the knot in his heart and gradually calmed down. Next, he had to pull himself together and carry out the task given to him by Ji Tianxing. Restoring the freedom of all the citizens of the Long Mountain region was a huge project that could not be completed overnight. Ji Tianxing left the residence of the Changshan domain master. Bai Long steered the deity slaying battleship and flew towards the northeast at lightning speed. He headed towards the next region to meet up with the Divine Phoenix clan leader and the rest. Although Ji Tianxing departed a day later, the distance was still slightly further. However, the speed of the deity slaying battleship ensured that he and the Divine Phoenix clan leader and the rest would arrive at their destination at the same time. The next morning, the deity slaying battleship was still on its way. A piece of news that came out of nowhere began to spread around Yenshu's heavenly abode. The rebel alliance led by Qin Shi has begun their operation. In just a few days, Qingfeng, Juha, and the other regions have been conquered by the rebel alliance. All the domain masters have surrendered. It was just a simple piece of news, but after it spread, it had an explosive effect and caused a huge sensation. In just a few hours, the news seemed to have grown wings and spread to the surrounding regions. Not only the major forces and empires, but also many citizens were talking about it. With all their previous experiences, the citizens had high hopes for the Kenshin Rebel Alliance. Even when they heard this shocking news, they did not think it was fake. Instead, they believed it to be true. Soon, the news was confirmed in Qingfeng, Jiuhe, and the other regions. After all, those two regions were the first to be conquered. The domain masters had followed Ji Tianxing's orders and issued orders to gradually restore the citizens' freedom. For nearly 1,000 years, the citizens had been under the dark rule of the Azura God Emperor. They had been oppressed and enslaved. If the Kenshin had not conquered those few regions, how could the domain masters issue orders to restore the citizens' freedom and stop their oppression and enslavement? After the news was confirmed, it spread even faster. With those few regions as the center, the news quickly spread in all directions. It had the potential to engulf the entire boundless heaven continent. The citizens were in an uproar. They cheered and celebrated the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance. They treated the Kenshin as their saviors. A day later, more than 40 regions and half of the boundless heaven continent knew about this news. Thus, countless domain masters were in a state of panic. Hundreds of millions of citizens were filled with excitement and anticipation. They looked forward to the arrival of the Rebel Alliance's powerhouses. They also wanted the citizens of Qingfeng, Jiuhe, and the other regions to regain their freedom as soon as possible and no longer be oppressed and enslaved. Of course, when this news spread across half of the continent, the imperial tutor in the Dark Night region in the far north also received the news. The news he received was far more detailed than the rumors outside. Not only did Qingfeng, Jiuhe, and the other regions surrender, but the domain masters also surrendered very straightforwardly. They did not discuss any conditions with the Kenshin and directly surrendered. When he heard this news, the imperial tutor was so angry that his lungs almost exploded. His entire body erupted with soaring, killing intent. He really wanted to teleport to Qingfeng, Jiuhe, and the other regions and cut those traitorous domain masters into pieces. Only then could he vent the hatred in his heart. Damn bastards! You are all domain masters, personally conferred by His Holiness the God Emperor. If not for His Holiness the God Emperor's support, how could you have such honorable positions? And now, you don't want to serve His Holiness the God Emperor and be loyal to the God Emperor. When the Kenshin attacked, you actually surrendered without any backbone. How infuriating! The protectors and generals hurriedly persuaded the imperial tutor to calm down and comforted him for a long time. When the imperial tutor's emotions slowly calmed down, the protectors and generals said worriedly, "Imperial tutor, we can't go on like this. The Rebel Alliance will split into two groups and attack the various regions, one from the south and one from the north. If the various regions don't unite, no one will be a match for the Kenshin Alliance. Imperial tutor, you also know that those domain masters are greedy for life and afraid of death. Their forces are weak and they can't fight against the Kenshin Alliance. They can only choose to surrender. Imperial tutor, you have to quickly come up with an idea. We can't let the Kenshin conquer the various regions one by one." Under everyone's urging, the imperial tutor considered for a moment and ordered, "I don't have a good idea. I can only take advantage of this. Immediately issue an edict and summon all the domain masters to the Dark Night region." Chapter 41:14. Everyone knew that it was easy to be defeated one by one if hundreds of area masters were to spread out and guard their own territories. Not to mention the Kenshin, even if a few of the Rebel Alliance's forces went, those area masters would not be able to resist. In order to survive, it was inevitable to admit defeat and surrender. Thus, the imperial tutor could only think of this idea that could not be considered a solution. "Aren't you going to subdue those area masters one by one? Then I'll issue an order and gather all the area masters to the Dark Night area to form an inescapable trap and ambush. The Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance's 9 forces would be empty-handed when they arrived at the various territories. They could not subdue those area masters, but they could not attack ordinary citizens, right? Moreover, time did not allow them to appoint a new area master to take over those territories. After all, taking charge of a territory was not something that could be done in a short period of time. On the other hand, manpower was also a big problem. If the Rebel Alliance had to send out a group of godly kings and godly lords every time they attacked a territory to occupy a certain territory, then it would not be long before the Rebel Alliance had no one to use. In any case, there were hundreds of territories in the Boundless Heaven continent. Even if the Rebel Alliance occupied 50 territories, the Imperial Tutor would not panic. Now, the Rebel Alliance had the initiative and attacked everywhere. The Imperial Tutor and the 100 Area Masters could only passively defend. If the Rebel Alliance occupied half of the continent, then the initiative would be handed to the Imperial Tutor. He could take the initiative to attack and destroy the Rebel Alliance's forces one by one. In short, the cheap trick he came up with was indeed effective. The protectors and generals thought for a moment and understood the Imperial Tutor's intention. They all nodded in agreement. Thus, the two protectors quickly drafted an edict and issued it as soon as possible. At the same time, Ji Tianxing boarded the God-slaying battleship and met up with the Divine Phoenix clan leader and the others. At this point, the 9 forces of the Rebel Alliance and Ji Tianxing officially split up and began their journey. Both sides advanced side by side, and they subdued 4 region lords in a short period of a few days with an unstoppable momentum. Wherever they went, they found the domain lords of the various domains and encountered almost no resistance. Those domain lords would usually put up a symbolic resistance, and after a few dozen of their subordinates were killed or injured, they would declare their defeat and surrender. Before surrendering, they had fantasized about negotiating terms with the Rebel Alliance and asking for some benefits. However, the Rebel Alliance's attitude was very unyielding. They directly threw out an oath of surrender and told them to read it. After those domain lords finished their oaths of surrender, they were like frosted eggplants, listless, and almost shut themselves up. It couldn't be helped. This was also the first time they had come into contact with this kind of heavenly Tao oath. The content of the oath, which was close to 1,000 words, shocked them. After the oath was made, the phenomenon of heaven and earth, as well as the invisible pressure of the heavenly Tao, caused them to feel fear and terror. These domain lords were somewhat regretful, but there was nothing they could do. They could only accept their fate. The reason why these few domain lords tactfully surrendered was because of the news that spread throughout the entire Boundless Heaven continent during this period of time. Everyone knew that the Rebel Alliance had split into 2 groups, the North and the South, and had begun their attack. The domain lords of the surrounding regions of Yinshu Grotto Heaven heard the news and surrendered and did not dare to resist. Therefore, those few domain lords took the lead. When the other domain lords saw this, there were already a few domain lords who had taken the lead to surrender. They were not iron head dolls who were seeking death. Of course, there was no need to fight to the death. It was safer to surrender. Soon, another 7 days had passed. As of now, the Rebel Alliance had subdued 10 domains, all of which were around Yinshu Grotto Heaven. As the domain lords announced their surrender one after another, all kinds of news began to spread throughout the Boundless Heaven continent. First, the Rebel Alliance was indeed as everyone thought. The Kenshin fought against the dark reign of the Azura God Emperor to save the people and restore everyone's freedom. Second, the Rebel Alliance had split into 2 groups, the North and the South, and were moving simultaneously. The group heading toward the south was led by the Nangong clan, followed by the Lan clan, Ares clan, Xia clan, Shimi Grotto Heaven, and Jiang clan. There were a total of 6 ancient clans, and all of them had deep foundations and strong warriors. Not to mention a domain lord. Even if a few domain lords were to band together, they would not be a match for them. Therefore, the South Army was like a hot knife through butter, and was successful in every endeavor. As for the group heading towards the north of Yinshu Grotto Heaven, there were only the Feng clan, Yuchi clan, and the 100 Smelting Ancient Sect. On the surface, these 3 forces could not be compared to the South Army, and their numbers were reduced by half. However, the North Army was personally led by the Kenshin. 1 Kenshin was equivalent to 10 ancient clans. Therefore, in the eyes of countless people, the North Army was the most valiant. Third, The goal of the Rebel Alliance was very clear, and that was to subdue the domain lords one by one. It was said that the oath of surrender, personally revised by the Kenshin, was very sacred and solemn, and was approved and supervised by the heavenly Tao. Those domain lords who surrendered had to recite the heavenly Tao oath. This news was obviously embellished by the people of the Rebel Alliance and deliberately released by the Shimi Grotto Heavens Intelligence Network. The purpose was to let the people think that the Kenshin and the Rebel Alliance were representing Tianxing, and that they represented justice and the will of the heavens. Those immortal king masters and top forces scoffed at this saying. However, the millions of people were more ignorant, and naturally, they believed it easily. Therefore, the people cheered and were full of admiration for the Kenshin and were full of anticipation for the Rebel Alliance. Especially those who were still living in the abyss of suffering and were enslaved and oppressed. They were looking forward day and night to the Rebel Alliance's early arrival to save them. Other than that, there was another piece of news that spread across the mainland. Not long ago, the Imperial Tutor personally issued a decree to all the domains in the mainland. The content of the decree was simple and straightforward, and it was to gather all the domain lords and gather at the Anya domain immediately. Although the decree did not state the reason and purpose. However, as long as one was not an idiot, one would know that this was the Imperial Tutor's countermeasure. In just half a month, the Rebel Alliance had conquered 10 domains in a row, and the Imperial Tutor could no longer sit still. The Imperial Tutor could not sit by and watch the Rebel Alliance continue, so he could only come up with this countermeasure to resolve the crisis. Countless forces, domain lords, empires, and people learned of this news, and after careful consideration, they all felt that the Imperial Tutor's move was not bad and could indeed resolve the crisis. At least, the Imperial Tutor could turn passive into active. He could turn the domains into empty cities and let the Rebel Alliance attack and occupy them. The Rebel Alliance would be empty-handed, and occupying those domains would waste time and manpower. If they did not occupy those domains, it would be equivalent to returning empty-handed, and it would be a waste of time. All in all, this was a brilliant plan. However, the key problem was, how many domain lords could the Imperial Tutor's decree mobilize? How many domain lords would continue to remain loyal and carry out the Imperial Tutor's orders? At such a chaotic juncture, most domain lords would probably weigh the pros and cons, right? Chapter 41:15. A few days later, new news spread across the boundless heaven continent. The Rebel Alliance's armies in the north and south were still attacking cities and conquering territory after territory. In the process, the Rebel Alliance would also eliminate targets on the death list. More than a dozen godly kings and 8 forces loyal to the Azura God Emperor were eradicated by the Rebel Alliance. At the same time, more than 30 territorial lords had rushed to the Dark Knight domain with their families and loyal subordinates. These territorial lords were all loyal supporters of the Azura God Emperor and would naturally be loyal to the Imperial Tutor's orders. They would rather temporarily give up their positions as territorial lords and gather by the Imperial Tutor's side. Firstly, it could save their lives and be safer. Secondly, it could show their loyalty. However, they could not leave for too long. They had to return to the territory they ruled in a year at the latest. Otherwise, too many things would happen in the next year, and the entire domain would be in chaos. Other than the 30 or so territorial lords who took the lead to express their stance, the remaining dozens of territorial lords were still hesitating and weighing the pros and cons. Even if the Imperial Tutor issued another decree and urged them with harsh words, they were unmoved and were still observing the situation. After all, they were all relatively far away and would not be attacked by the Rebel Alliance for the time being. They were still considered safe. Moreover, they were unwilling to give up their positions as territorial lords and return to the Dark Knight domain. These territorial lords all understood that in their own domains, they were the noble kings. Once they returned to the Dark Knight domain, they would be soldiers under others and at their beck and call. Moreover, after leaving their own domains, no one knew what would happen, and the future could not be predicted. They did not dare to take risks easily. Of course, the most important reason was that the Rebel Alliance had also responded and counterattacked. When Ji Tianqing learned that the imperial tutor had issued a decree and that many territorial lords had rushed to the Dark Knight domain with their families, he immediately thought of a way to deal with it. Since those territorial lords are loyal to the Azura God Emperor, we don't have to be merciful to them. They are rushing to the Dark Knight domain, but they will leave behind many trusted generals to help them control the various domains. The imperial tutor thought that we were pursuing speed, so we wouldn't stop or waste time occupying these areas. Then we'll kill the trusted aides left behind by those domain lords, eliminate the forces they control in the various domains, and let those domains break free from their control. Of course, we won't split our forces and waste time conquering the various regions. That was to pick a puppet from the first-rate forces of each domain to control that domain. If you can think of a better way, please send a message to me as soon as possible and let me decide. This was Ji Tianqing's order, and it was quickly passed on to the various forces. The day after he gave the order, he led the Northern Army into a certain domain and headed straight for the domain lord's cave residence. When he arrived at the cave residence, he discovered that the domain master had fled with his family and subordinates the day before, heading for the Dark Knight domain. Ji Tianqing was not angry. He led the Phoenix race, Yuchi race, and the 100 Refinements ancient sect to destroy the territorial lord's cave dwelling. A secret realm with a radius of 100,000 miles was shattered into pieces by his shocking divine ability and scattered in the void. More than 10,000 soldiers under the territorial lord's command were buried with the secret realm. Not even their bones were left. In addition, Ji Tianqing also led an army of 3,000 to eradicate the forces controlled by the territorial lord. He assassinated more than 10 trusted aides, including 3 empire lords, although he did waste 3 days doing so. However, Ji Tianqing destroyed the territorial lord's direct forces in an unstoppable manner. The forces that the territorial lord had spent hundreds of years to accumulate were destroyed in an instant. The domain also broke free from the territorial lord's control and fell into a state of chaos. At least, no one enslaved and oppressed the common people anymore. The common people of the various empires rose up and resisted. For a time, the various empires were also in a state of war, tired of dealing with the common people's counterattacks. The entire domain was in chaos. A day later, the territorial lord was still on his way to the Dark Knight domain. When he heard the news, he was so angry that he vomited 3 bowls of blood on the spot and almost fainted. Kenshin, didn't you claim to be a benevolent and righteous teacher, representing the heavenly Tao and justice? How can you be so cruel and vicious, killing tens of thousands of soldiers and plunging the entire domain into the flames of war? Before the territorial lord fainted, he roared at the sky like a madman. There was no other way. His life's work had been destroyed, and his position as territorial lord existed in name only. How could he not go crazy? After shouting these 2 sentences, his neck tilted and he fainted. At this time, the few trusted generals, military counselors, and deputy territorial lords who followed him began to panic. Everyone thought to themselves, "Territorial lord, O territorial lord." Previously, everyone advised you not to escape to the Dark Knight domain. We would rather observe the situation first, but you insisted on being stubborn. Now you know that you were wrong, right? Kenshin is indeed speaking on behalf of Tianqing and saving the common people, but it doesn't mean that he is holy and kind and won't kill people. Don't forget, the reason why Kenshin has today's fame is because he killed millions and stepped on piles of corpses. To us, Kenshin is a cruel and vicious executioner. But in the eyes of the common people, we are the evil ones. Kenshin is eliminating evil and promoting kindness. Obviously, after the territorial lord had lost his power, the deputy territorial lords and generals under his command had also developed resentment and other thoughts. 2 days later, the Rebel Alliance's Southern Army encountered a similar situation. When Nangong Bua led 6 forces and 6,000 soldiers to a certain region, they discovered that the territorial lord had escaped in the middle of the night. Not only did the territorial lord take away his trusted generals and godly king experts, but he also took away his family and treasure trove. The huge secret realm cave abode was like an empty city. Only tens of thousands of ordinary soldiers were left. Nangong Buhua decisively ordered the 6,000 soldiers to attack the cave abode and destroy it in a few hours. The secret realm was shattered, and the tens of thousands of soldiers were not left behind. After destroying the territorial lord's cave abode, Nangong Buhua split up the 6 forces to eliminate the territorial lord's direct subordinates. At the same time, Nangong Buhua chose a force in the region and supported this force to take over the territorial lord's position. This force was one of the top 3 forces in the region and had always had conflicts and grudges with the territorial lord. However, they were always suppressed. The grudges between the two sides had accumulated for a long time. Now that the territorial lord had escaped and the cave abode had been destroyed, this force took the opportunity to join the rebel alliance without hesitation. They swore to be loyal to the Kenshin. The result was obvious. That force naturally took over the region and became the territorial lord appointed by the Kenshin. Moreover, this force would do its best to stabilize the region with its own forces and methods. They would eliminate the forces and disasters left behind by the previous territorial lord and save the common people of the entire region, restoring everyone's freedom. This way, this force would be able to quickly stabilize the region and obtain the gratitude and support of hundreds of millions of people. Just like that, the previous territorial lord was replaced by an enemy before he even met the imperial tutor. When the territorial lord heard the news, he was furious. Chapter 41:16. In less than 2 days, the news spread throughout the boundless heaven continent. In any case, the people of the entire continent had been paying attention to the movements of the rebel alliance and the imperial tutor in the past few months. Many territorial lords, major forces, empires, and hundreds of millions of people were discussing the battle situation, strategies, and movements of both sides every day. When everyone learned of the tragic end of the 2 territorial lords, they were all surprised by the rebel alliance's ability to adapt. 2 days ago, the people of the entire boundless heaven continent were still lamenting that the imperial tutor's plan was very good. He could seize the initiative and put the rebel alliance in a dilemma. They did not expect that in the blink of an eye, the imperial tutor's plan would be broken by Kenshin. Didn't you summon those territorial lords to gather at the Dark Knight domain? You want us to come empty-handed without being able to divide our forces to occupy the various domains? Fine, then we'll directly destroy those territorial lords' cave abodes, kill all the soldiers under his command, and destroy the foundation of his forces. Moreover, we can also support other forces to replace you as territorial lord and throw the entire domain into chaos for you. Those territorial lords of yours who escaped did not even reach the Dark Knight domain before their life's work was destroyed. Are you angry? Let me ask you, are you angry? When countless territorial lords, empires, and top forces heard this news, their hearts were heavy, melancholy, and worried. As for those who remained neutral and watched the show, they watched with relish and commented on the plans of both sides. As for the hundreds of millions of people, of course, they cheered and applauded. They recognized and worshipped Kenshin even more, who said that Kenshin only had powerful strength and did not have shrewdness and schemes. No matter how good the imperial tutor was at scheming, wasn't he still easily crushed by Kenshin? Did you think that Kenshin would not kill people just because he spoke on behalf of Tianqing? The name of Kenshin was built on the accumulation of millions of lives. When it came to Kenshin's brilliant military exploits and shocking achievements, it could be talked about for 3 days and 3 nights. Just like that, the entire boundless heaven continent was boiling with excitement and panic. The dozens of territorial lords who were watching the situation had the most complicated and tormented feelings. They had been waiting to see how the rebel alliance would deal with the imperial tutor's plan. Now, the results were out. The rebel alliance's attitude was very unyielding. If these domain lords dared to flee, then they would uproot their forces. If you don't want to be the domain lord, then I'll choose someone else. Anyway, the boundless heaven continent had many forces. There were also many divine king powerhouses who wanted to be the region lord. With the Rebel Alliance's support and the Kenshin's approval and conferment, any deity king could become a ruler. Realizing this, the dozens of domain masters began to panic. As the Rebel Alliance's two armies continued to advance, they conquered more and more territories. The domain lords did not have much time left and had to make a decision as soon as possible. This time, other than those who were truly loyal to the Shura God Emperor, those who still had hope in the Shura God Emperor would choose to bring their families to the Dark Knight domain. The other 90% of the domain lords chose to preserve their power and status and remained in their respective domains. It was fine if they did not leave. As long as they obediently admitted defeat and surrendered, the Kenshin would definitely not kill them. The position of Region Lord would still belong to them. If they dared to flee to the Dark Knight domain, even if they saved their lives, they would lose their life's work and the position of Region Lord. Time passed quickly. The boundless heaven continent had been in chaos, bustling, and clamoring. Almost every 2 days, there would be new news about which domain the Rebel Alliance had conquered. Among those territories conquered by the Rebel Alliance, which domain had abolished slavery. Hundreds of millions of people had regained their freedom and no longer had to be oppressed and exploit resources all day long. A few days later, another force, a well-known divine king powerhouse, was killed by the Rebel Alliance. It turned out that a certain powerhouse was actually a loyal lackey of the imperial tutor despite his sanctimonious appearance. Just like that, the Rebel Alliance continued to spread new news and the Kenshin's reputation grew. On the other side, the Dark Knight domain had also gathered 36 region lords and hundreds of divine king powerhouses. However, the imperial tutor had gathered such a terrifying number of powerhouses and military strength, but he still held back and did not launch a counterattack. The hundreds of millions of people in the Boundless Heaven continent were discussing this. Logically speaking, the imperial tutor's military strength was several times that of the Rebel Alliance's. If he took the initiative to attack, he would definitely be able to easily destroy the Rebel Alliance's two armies. What was the imperial tutor trying to do? Why did he not counterattack? Was he going to defend the Dark Knight domain to the death and let the Rebel Alliance conquer all the domains one by one? This was definitely the stupidest and most useless method. Even if people thought so. Of course, the imperial tutor would not do so. Therefore, countless people were speculating that the imperial tutor was definitely plotting some conspiracy. The Rebel Alliance was still attacking cities and strongholds, sweeping through the various domains like the autumn wind sweeping the fallen leaves. However, Ji Tianxing realized that the situation was not so simple, and he also smelled the scent of a conspiracy. He repeatedly reminded the 9 major forces under his command that they must not underestimate the enemy and must be cautious. He had a premonition that it wouldn't be long before the imperial preceptor made his move. Just as expected, the imperial tutor was still overseeing the Dark Knight domain, and on the surface, he seemed to be doing nothing. In reality, he had already mobilized more than 400 god kings and more than 30,000 divine lords to gather in the Dark Knight domain. In the past 2 months, these soldiers had already formed an inescapable net in the Dark Knight domain, forming layers of barriers and defensive lines. At the same time, he secretly sent a team to quietly rush to the south of the Boundless Heaven continent without anyone knowing. He named that team the God Slayer, in reference to the killing of the Kenshin. The God-punishing army was led by 2 protectors. It was made up of 50 god kings and 5,000 god monarchs. The 2 guardians leading the team had been guarding the Azura Divine Palace for thousands of years and had almost never appeared in front of the world. The strength and status of the 2 guardians were on par with the patrol commander Qi Yan. The 50 god kings in the team were made up of 40 patrol commanders and 10 god generals who had been through hundreds of battles. After the Meng Shuai was killed, the god generals under his command were leaderless, and the imperial tutor took over. These god generals had participated in the War of the Gods 1,000 years ago, and now they were all at the 8th heaven of the God King realm. This was the weakness of the 40 patrol commanders. The strongest was a 7th heaven realm God King, and the weakest was a fifth Heaven Realm God King. Even so, this team of more than 5,000 people was enough to destroy the Rebel Alliance's southern army. The 5,000 God Slayer members rode on 2 King-grade upper-grade divine ships and quietly rushed to the south of the continent. Their speed was not fast, but their priority was to hide their tracks and auras, and they could not be detected by anyone. In fact, the Imperial Tutor did not use the Domain Masters, but used the patrol commanders and God Generals to keep it a secret. Now, his trust in the Domain Masters was greatly reduced. Even though the Imperial Tutor stayed behind to guard the Dark Knight domain, he was constantly in contact with the God Slayer, so that he could react according to the situation. The Rebel Alliance's northern army seemed weak, but it was personally led by Kenshin, and the Imperial Tutor knew that he could not afford to provoke it. Therefore, the God Slayer's goal was to destroy the southern army. Chapter 41:17. Ji Tianxing had a premonition that the Imperial Tutor was up to something. However, he could not predict the future, nor could he guess the Imperial Tutor's plan out of thin air. Therefore, other than reminding the few forces under his command to be careful, he could not make any other arrangements. He was not too worried about the northern army that he was leading. As long as he was not separated from the Phoenix clan, Yuchi clan, and Hunter Refinement's ancient sect, these 3 forces were very safe. Jin Shuang, Qi Yin, and Meng Shuai were all killed by him. His invincible strength was known to the world. As long as the Imperial Tutor was not crazy, he would not send people to attack his northern army. Therefore, he was most worried about the southern army. Although the southern army was made up of 6 forces, there were more than 6,000 people in total. It seemed that this army was strong and had many powerful people. They were not to be trifled with. However, that was relative. To the domain lords of the various regions, it was naturally a force that they could not contend against. However, to the Imperial Tutor, it was obviously a pushover. After all, the soldiers that the Imperial Tutor gathered were in the tens of thousands. Considering this point, Ji Tianxing sent 3 messages to Nangong Buhua within 5 days, reminding him to be careful and not to be arrogant. He did not know if it was a reminder from the heavens or a premonition. Ji Tianxing had a trace of uneasiness in his heart, and it was getting more and more serious. This was the premonition of a powerful person, although he could not really predict the future and deduce the secrets of the heavens. However, he could sense and be alert, and he could tell that the uneasiness was related to the southern army. After sending 3 messages, Ji Tianxing did not mention this matter again. He led the Phoenix clan, Yuchi clan, and Hunter Refinement's ancient sect to the north of Yinshu Grotto Heaven, conquering various regions along the way. With him personally holding the fort, those territorial lords who did not escape to the Dark Knight region were very sensible. As soon as he appeared, they immediately bowed their heads and obediently recited the oath of surrender. After surrendering, those domain lords had to intentionally show their loyalty or try to curry favor in front of Ji Tianxing by volunteering to carry out some missions. However, as usual, Ji Tianxing did not assign them any tasks. He only asked them to maintain the stability of the region and restore the freedom of the people as soon as possible. If there were any orders or missions, he would send out orders to inform these domain masters. Just like that, 7 days passed by peacefully. Ji Tianxing led the northern army and conquered 7 regions in a row. In order to speed up their journey, he simply asked the 3 forces to retrieve their respective divine ships. More than 3,000 soldiers were gathered in his god-slaying battleship. Everyone traveled together, and their speed more than doubled. In any case, it was a supreme-grade king-grade divine warship. Its interior was extremely spacious, and it could be changed at will. It was more than enough to accommodate more than 3,000 people. The 3 factions expressed their compliance and gladly accepted this. It was good that they could increase their speed and increase their safety. After all, it was Kenshin's flagship. It would definitely be of a higher grade and safer than their own warships. However, when Ji Tianxing led the 3 forces to conquer another region, they were shocked. On this night, the god-slaying battleship sped through the night sky, rushing to the next region. The Shami Grotto Heavens Intelligence Network had already investigated clearly. The next region's domain lord had not escaped. He was still sitting in his cave abode, waiting for his death. Or rather, waiting for Qin Shin to conquer him. At this moment, Ji Tianxing's uneasiness suddenly became more and more intense. It had already begun to affect his state of mind, making it impossible for him to remain calm. At first, he thought that he had been too worried recently, causing him to feel uneasy. However, even after circulating his energy for an hour, he was still unable to suppress his anxiety and uneasiness. Thus, he realized that something must have happened to the Southern Army. Such a strong sense of uneasiness meant that the situation was very serious. He pondered for a moment, then summoned the Divine Phoenix clan leader, Yuchi clan leader, and Su Balian to urgently discuss this matter. After the three leaders received the summons, they quickly came to Ji Tianxing's secret room. Lord Alliance leader, what happened? Lord Alliance leader summoned us in the middle of the night. Did something big happen? No matter what you are worried about, Lord Alliance leader, please tell us. We are willing to share your worries. Ever since the Rebel Alliance was established, they had always been victorious. They had never tasted defeat. Now, the entire Boundless Heaven continent was spreading the Rebel Alliance's name, praising and praising Kenshin. Even their factions were treated as saviors and heroes by the billions of people. The three factions did not pay any casualties, but they received so much praise and support from the people. Of course, they were overjoyed. Perhaps when they first joined the Rebel Alliance, they were still a little uneasy and uncertain about the future. However, now, they were 100 times more confident and approved of the Rebel Alliance. In fact, they even wanted to have a real battle to show off their martial prowess and make meritorious contributions. Ji Tianxing waved his hand, indicating that the three leaders did not need to be so excited. He said calmly, "In the past few days, I had a sudden impulse to use a secret technique to deduce the heavenly cycle and predict good and bad luck. As expected, the Southern Army is afraid of a disaster and may not be able to survive this. Therefore, I will personally make a trip to the south. The three factions will each take a warship and rush to the next area. Just act according to the original plan. That zone leader has long had the intention to surrender. He is just waiting for us to arrive and go through the motions. Therefore, you will not encounter any danger on this trip. If things change, you must not fight head-on. Remember to conserve your strength and report to me first." Hearing him say this, the three leaders understood what was going on. At the same time, they were also worried about the Southern Army. "Lord Alliance leader, please rest assured. We will definitely act according to your orders. Lord Alliance leader, please pay attention to your safety and be careful. Lord Alliance leader, you are our spiritual leader and the spiritual pillar of the entire Boundless Heaven continent. Nothing must happen to you." The three leaders also reminded Ji Tianxing. Ji Tianxing did not say anything else. He put away the Godslayer warship on the spot and parted ways with the three factions. More than 3,000 soldiers appeared in the night sky. The three leaders hurriedly took out the warship and ordered their disciples to board it. Bai Long steered the Godslayer warship and flew south with Ji Tianxing. After flying for 100,000 miles, Ji Tianxing glanced at Bai Long, seeing that he had only used 80% of the Godslayer warship's power. He said, "No need to conserve your strength. Full speed ahead." Full speed ahead meant giving it their all. Every hour, they would use up billions of resources. In a day, they would use up close to 100 billion resources. Bai Long was stunned. He looked at Ji Tianxing with some surprise and asked, "Master, is there a need for this? Could it be that the Southern Army has really encountered a disaster?" Ji Tianxing nodded slightly and said, "I rarely have such premonitions. Since it has appeared, it must be true. To be safe, we should hurry over and meet up with the Southern Army." Book Guest House Reading Website.